Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McMillan.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stuart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. The first item of business is time for reflection, and our time for reflection leader today is Carol Telfer, Chaplain of Glasgow Hospice, Mairi Curie.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak. Mairi Curie aims to be a beacon of support to those at the end of their lives, ensuring that they and their families receive the compassion, respect and care that they deserve. The Mairi Curie Great Daffodil Appeal takes place every March, marking a significant fundraising campaign to support the vital work of Mairi Curie. It has grown to become one of the UK's most widely recognised charity campaigns, deeply rooted in community participation. The daffodil pin is not just our symbol, but it is recognised as a lifeline for many families and worn as an act of solidarity. From our inpatient units to our community outreach, staff prepare to cope with any eventuality. Day and night, teams care for patients and their families by giving willingly of themselves where the need for support is greatest. Mairi Curie services ensure our patients receive the nursing and medical treatment needed in a caring, dignified environment, whether in the hospice or at home. From personalised medical and physical support to psychological, spiritual and emotional care, whatever the illness, whatever stage of the journey, our aim is to help our patients live the best possible life right to the end. However, we don't step away at that point, but continue to support families in the months ahead through our bereavement service. A verse in the Bible reminds us to love our neighbours as ourselves. And whilst we are not a faith-based organisation, this principle of aiming to treat everyone with love and compassion is key in all that we do. John came to us to have the symptoms of his illness managed. He was experiencing physical and emotional distress. Whilst the medical team worked on his physical symptoms, other professionals worked on his emotional ones. It transpired that John felt he had missed the opportunity to marry the love of his life. He wanted to give her security, better provided for her if they were married. Working together as a team, a week later, John was standing in the Mairi Curie Hospice quiet room, waiting for his bride to arrive. I was privileged to be able to conduct their wedding ceremony in front of patients and staff, that John described as his extended family. This is just one of the many stories I could share with you. As people engage with the services offered by Marie Curie, this can prove to be a life-changing experience in so many different ways, both today and into the future. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Chaplain.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next item of business. Point of order, Pam Gossel.
Presiding officer, on the 12th of March, when my party was holding a party business on equalities and I was sponsoring a roundtable titled "The Power of Women's Voices," guests to the Scottish Parliament were felt they were treated with unjustified levels of suspicion. Upon entering the chamber, one woman had her scarf in the colours of suffragettes confiscated, another woman had her trousers waistband searched, and another had her bag turned out and told she could only wear one of her label badges. A third was told to remove her women's rights.
Ms Gossel, sorry, if I might just stop you there, just for clarity. A point of order is in relation to whether proper procedures are or have been followed in relation to our proceedings, regarding an item of business. And I'd just be interested if the member could explain which point of order, which rule the member is referring to.
I haven't got the rule, but it's basically asking the question how these women were treated, and I've got 3 questions to ask the presiding officer for that.
Okay. Thank you, Ms Gossel. This is not a point of order, and it's not appropriate for the Chair of Parliamentary Business to comment on any other matters that are out with the standing orders at this point. But certainly we can discuss this out with the Chamber. I haven't received your correspondence yet, Ms Gossel, but I'll look forward to receiving it. Thank you. Now, we're moving on to topical questions. And at question number 1, I call Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what its position is on the reported decision to award Phase 1 of the small vessel replacement programme to a Polish shipyard.
Deputy First Minister.
While there will be disappointment that Ferguson Marine was not identified as lead bidder, for our islands this is an important milestone in the procurement to build and deliver 7 new small vessels for our ferry network. These new vessels will help improve connectivity and resilience for island residents, businesses and communities, and their electric operation will contribute to the reduced carbon emissions from Scotland's ferry fleet and make ferry travel more sustainable. And if I could just point out, Presiding Officer, in advance of further questions, this is a live procurement process and we are limited in what we can say during the 10-day standstill period. The process is being led by CMAL as the procuring authority.
Thank you. Stuart McMillan.
I thank the Deputy First Minister for that reply, and the Deputy First Minister will clearly be aware of the frustration of many people in my community, including the local workforce of Ferguson Marine and myself, who clearly want answers to vital questions, including where did Ferguson Marine rank out the 5 candidate locations, how was the bid in terms of quality and price in comparison to other yards, and what does the Scottish Government now do to ensure Ferguson Marine has a future? Will the Deputy First Minister answer these 3 questions now, and if she isn't able to because of the 10-day standstill period, will she commit to publishing this information when that concludes?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I understand that the member understands that this is a live procurement, so there are limitations on what I can say right now or the level of information that I can share in the process. CMAL are the procurement authority and Scottish ministers did not play any part in the review of the bids. CMAL have started that 10-day standstill period before the contract can be signed. However, we understand from Ferguson Marine's feedback that they scored highly on quality, and as noted in the news release, CMAL used a technical quality weighting of 65% for this contract, with 35% for price. If I can quote directly from the CFO, David Dishon, he said, "We are very proud of our bid, and although we priced it competitively, we were up against extremely tough competition." He said, "We were pleased to see Ferguson Marine's bid rated so highly on quality, and reaching the final round of bidding demonstrates the strength of our proposal and gives us renewed confidence in our ability to produce Clyde-built ships that are world-class." I understand that the member has received some assurances from CMAL directly on the process that was carried out as well.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank the Deputy First Minister again. I've never doubted the abilities of the shop floor workforce And the fact that they have built vessels with some antiquated equipment highlights their abilities, including building the 3 previous small vessels. And quite frankly, Deputy First Minister, the workforce have been let down by the board and also by the management of the yard. Now, what steps will the Scottish Government now take to ensure that there is a board and a management at the helm who can deliver a yard the workforce deserves? Will the Deputy First Minister agree to meet with Alex Logan, the shop steward, and myself to discuss the future of Ferguson Marine? And can the Deputy First Minister say if there is a prospect of the yard being directly awarded work from phase 2 of the small vessel replacement programme?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, can I start by agreeing with Stuart McMillan about the ability and the dedication of the workforce, and say that I would be very happy to meet with Alex Logan and Stuart McMillan to discuss these matters. I've spoken with Alex on a number of occasions, and I hugely value his commitment to the workforce and his insights as well. The member Stuart McMillan talked about the equipment and so on, which is why we have agreed and allocated up to £14.2 million over the next 2 years to enhance the yard infrastructure and deliver productivity improvements so that they are in a better place to be able to bid competitively. And we will consider future vessel contracts from public agencies, but the board is developing its commercial strategy, and that targets a range of opportunities and will be spearheaded by the new chief executive when they come into post, which we hope is shortly.
Thank you. Sue Webber.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The SNP's catastrophic mismanagement of Ferguson's means that ferries which could have been built on the west coast of Scotland are instead looking like they're going to be made in Eastern Europe. Phase 2 of the small vessel replacement programme is a long way off, Deputy First Minister. So in light of this, can the Deputy First Minister outline what actions the Scottish Government are taking to ensure the Glen Rosa is delivered on time? And will the Deputy First Minister deliver a statement to Parliament on what the future is for Ferguson Marine and the hundreds of jobs that depend upon it?
Deputy First
Well, of
Minister.
course, the hundreds of jobs have only been protected because of the actions of this government, and the constant negativity from the Conservatives, using words like catastrophic, does nothing to help the yard secure work on the open market, and it is extremely frustrating to hear that. The bottom line here is that Ferguson Marine are focused on completing the Glen Rosa. We await, as the committee does, I know, an update from the yard in terms of timescales. The second focus is their commercial strategy, which was never only predicated on one contract, because that would be no commercial strategy. The point here is that they have additional work coming in, which we hope to be secured in April. There are other contracts that they are very hopeful of securing shortly, which David Dishon referred to in his commentary yesterday. And there are other opportunities around the small vessel replacement programme phase 2. She will know that extensive analysis and legal advice indicated that a direct award of this current SVRP contract to Ferguson Marine would have introduced substantial risk, perhaps creating the worst of both worlds, where the boats don't get delivered to the islanders and Ferguson Marine don't get the contract because it ends up in the courts. And that is what we have tried to avoid, and why we agreed to open procurement.
Thank you. Claire Baker.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, it is a sorry state of affairs when a shipyard, nationalised by the SNP government, is not competitive and is unable to successfully bid for work that was widely recognised to be a good fit for Ferguson's. To secure work, Ferguson's need investment and support as well as stability. Does the Scottish Government believe that the current procurement process for our ferry fleet is fit for purpose in light of the failure to secure the work for Ferguson's?
Deputy First Minister.
I find that question quite remarkable, because the member has essentially told me that they don't think the procurement process is fit for purpose because Ferguson Marine didn't win. And the point here is that a procurement process needs to be fair, it needs to inspire confidence, and if there had been an alternative decision made by CMAL, who are acting independently of ministers, and it's important to stress that point, I think the questions would have been what else ministers have been doing. The bottom line here is the member has asked for about investment support, and yes, we have agreed £14.2 million to invest in equipment, to invest in the yard, so that it can compete on a global basis. She talked about stability, and the commercial strategy is very clear about the potential work that the yard can secure. The yard has secured additional work, and it would be nice to see the yard being recognised for the work that it has secured to date whilst it completes the Glen Rosa. And perhaps if we talked more about the skills and the ability of the yard here, instead of constantly talking it down, they might have greater potential to win that work.
Thank you. As you may expect, there's great interest in the questions before us today. In order to get in as many members as possible, concise questions and responses would be appreciated. I call Jamie Green.
Thank you. I have to say the hubris from the Minister today is outstanding. Ferguson Marine has not been let down by the board. It's been let down by the SNP front benches and the Scottish Government. How on earth is it supposed to compete on price with Poland and Turkey? If that's the case, then how are they ever going to win any contracts? Surely what the workers at Ferguson Marine want to know, and the Deputy First Minister has an opportunity right now to do so, is look into that camera up there and tell those workers and the people of Inverclyde why this Scottish Government and their agencies have lost confidence in their ability to build ships in Scotland.
Deputy First Minister.
Into any camera, I've been at the yard and I speak directly to the workers on a regular basis. And what I find incredibly frustrating in all of this conversation is it's not about how I feel, it's about supporting Ferguson Marine to be able to procure and secure work in an open procurement process which is fair, and to support them to be as competitive as possible. That is the reason for the investment of the £14.2 million. The commercial strategy never would rely on one contract alone. The point here is that they are competing for a number of different opportunities. Some of that work they have already secured. So I stand here reflecting on the talents and the skills of the workforce in having secured work already, and we will back them to be as competitive as possible with this investment in additional support.
Katie Clark.
Does the Cabinet Secretary accept that there is both a social and economic value in the yard, and there would have been a public value in a direct award? Does she accept that whilst there has been no shortage of money spent, there has been a lack of investment, and the investment now is too little and too late? Does she accept that we now need investment to ensure future contracts are made to Port Glasgow? And can she outline how the £14.2 million she has referred to is to be spent?
Deputy First Minister.
I thank the member for those questions, which I think are very fair questions. The point on terms of public value of a direct award, I take that question really seriously. My concern, and I outlined it in last summer, although I didn't make the final decision, that's for CMAL, the issue that we had is that in a very, very litigious industry, to have gone down the direct award route created significant levels of risk that would have resulted in this contract potentially being in the courts, ensuring that Ferguson Marine didn't get the work when they needed it, and that the islanders didn't get the vessels. Now, she may shake her head at that, but I'm afraid, looking at the legal advice and the analysis that was done, that was a very real and pressing possibility. And that the route that we've taken right now ensures that we have reached this significant milestone in delivering 7 new vessels for our islanders. But she's right in talking about investment. And whilst there's been a lot of attention given to the funds that have been given by the government to deliver the Glen Rosa and the Glen Sannox, that is not the same as investing in the yard itself. And that £14.2 million is based on a list of priorities that Ferguson Marine have supplied us with around equipment and infrastructure at the yard, which will make them globally competitive.
Thank you. Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Deputy First Minister confirm that the Permanent Secretary advised the Scottish Government that it would be illegal to make a direct award? That's certainly what he told the Finance Committee this morning. And can she expand on what these 7 small vessels will actually mean for our rural and island communities?
Deputy First Minister.
The 7 small vessels are going to be absolutely transformational for our island communities, and we know it's well documented how challenging it has been for those islanders, and that supplements the 6 larger vessels that are due to come into service over these years. So that, I think, is in no doubt it will be transformational. This is an important milestone, and we have to make sure that that procurement process is complete and the boats are delivered. In terms of the legal advice, I will say that there was extensive analysis, there was extensive legal advice that indicated that a direct award of the SVRP contract to Ferguson Marine would have introduced substantial risks, potentially meaning that the yard didn't have ships to build and our islanders didn't have the ships that they need. And that was not a risk that I thought appropriate to introduce into this process.
Thank you. We move to question number 2. I call Jackie Baillie.
To ask the Scottish Government for what reason hospitals are reportedly still using MRI scanners, CT scanners and X-ray machines that are decades old, in light of reported warnings by experts that equipment over 10 years old should be replaced.
Cabinet Secretary Neil Gray.
Presiding Officer, as Jackie Baillie will appreciate, equipment does not just cease to function as soon as it reaches 10 years old. However, we know that equipment does not have an infinite lifespan either, and life cycle replacement planning is ongoing. This includes an ongoing radiotherapy replacement programme supported by annual funding, including £18.5 million this year. A further £19 million has also been allocated for equipment investment this year as part of additional funding provided to the portfolio at the spring budget revision. This supports replacement ultrasound and X-ray machines and other imaging equipment. In the 2025-26 budget, it provides a 5% uplift to Board's core capital allocations, supporting maintenance and replacement programmes, and a further £30 million supports priority equipment replacement based on Board's assessment of need.
Jackie Baillie.
In hospitals across Scotland, patients are going back to the future with vital MRI and CT scanners that are often over 15 years old, X-ray machines that are up to 27 years old. Now, the Cabinet Secretary will be aware of the independent report recommending that CT and MRI machines over 10 years old should be retired. The Society of Radiographers has said that older equipment is unreliable and often operationally slower. So can I firstly ask the Cabinet Secretary, how far does unreliable equipment contribute to the current diagnostic waiting times? And secondly, given the extra £2.5 billion for Scotland's NHS from the UK Labour government, can he confirm when the out-of-date machines will actually be replaced?
Secretary. Well, I believe I've already answered the second part of Jackie Baillie's question in answer to the first, in terms of the allocation of resources that we're giving to boards to take the decisions. And of course, it's also for boards to take a risk-based analysis as to the appropriateness of the equipment that they have before them, both in terms of the parts availability and maintenance, and also in terms of their reliability and productivity. And it's on that basis that we take our assessments. On the first part of the question, Jackie Baillie will know that we're already seeing improvements in diagnostic waiting lists. Q4 of 2024 had the 4th largest improvement since the pandemic, and at the end of December the waiting list had reduced by over 18,000 compared to the end of 2024. So there is significant progress being made in diagnostic testing, and there's more to come with the budget that Jackie Baillie didn't vote for.
Jackie Baillie.
Well, far be it for me to point out that it was the UK Labour government that gave you the money and the SNP failed to vote for it. Failed to vote for it in Westminster. Just a fact, Presiding Officer. I note that the Cabinet Secretary set out the money. He didn't say when the machines would be replaced. We know that outdated equipment is only part of the story, and only a few weeks ago I asked the First Minister about the reported shortage of clinical radiologists, which is projected to rise to 263 fewer posts than needed by 2028. The effects are being felt now. The latest diagnostics waiting list data shows that at the end of last year, there were 3,954 waits of over a year. That's an 11.7% increase in the space of a year. When will these long waits be eradicated, ensuring that patients needing tests are seen without any further delay?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've already set out the higher level data around waiting times, but the latest figures show that our plan to bring down waiting times is delivering. That was part of a £30 million investment that came in this financial year. We're investing £100 million in the current year. The £30 million delivered almost 56,500 diagnostic procedures, exceeding the original plan to deliver 40,000, so that's up by 41%, reducing the waiting list size for imaging by almost 12% and scopes by more than 4%. So the plan that we have in place, and I remind Jackie Baillie, one, that she didn't support the budget to see that money going into the system to see those reductions in waiting time. So she wants to see the end without willing the means. We are delivering upon, and I look forward to reporting more on this regard to Parliament in due course.
Thank you. Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Unlike Jackie Baillie, I was really proud to vote for the Scottish budget along with the Cabinet Secretary, providing that record direct investment for our National Health Service here in Scotland. It's really important that we recognise that the money involved in that is money which is Scotland's money, and it's for this Parliament to decide how that money is allocated. I voted for it, the Cabinet Secretary voted for it, and Jackie Baillie and our colleagues did not. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide an update on his engagement with health boards regarding the potential for that funding to be used to update equipment, whilst also encouraging conversations on increasing innovation across the NHS and social care?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Joe Fitzpatrick for his question. Of course, as part of the budget and budgets passed, we've also taken decisions here in Scotland to raise additional revenue by using the powers of this Parliament around taxation, which again the Labour Party apparently doesn't support any longer. We are already working with all health boards to develop a whole system NHS infrastructure plan that focuses on reform, innovation and resilience. This includes specific consideration of ongoing equipment replacement cycle work undertaken by the NHS National Equipment Group, and the first part of this whole system planning work, which is to assess immediate priorities, it's well underway, includes assessment of the priority of equipment replacement. It's supported by funding of £30 million for this coming financial year, and this is in addition to the funding that's already allocated each year to the radiotherapy equipment programme.
Thank you. Question number 3, Tess White.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will review public sector guidance on single-sex spaces in light of reported concerns about the Care Inspectorate and the Scottish Prison Service.
Cabinet Secretary Shirley-Anne Somerville.
In April 2022, the Equality and Human Rights Commission published some revisions to their guidance entitled Separate and Single-Sex Service Providers, a Guide on the Equality Act, Sex and Gender Reassignment Provisions. In this guide, the Commission clearly states that as regulator for the Equality Act 2010, they provide guidance on the law to help organisations comply with their legal obligations. The Commission has recently completed a consultation on their statutory codes of practice that sets out the steps that should be taken to ensure people are not discriminated against. The codes of practice explain how the Equality Act 2010 works in relation to provision of services, public functions and associations, providing practical examples to illustrate how the law can be used to protect equality. The updated codes of practice have yet to be published. The Scottish Government expects all relevant organisations to comply with the requirements of the 2010 Act and other legislation in their role as employers.
Tess White.
Cabinet Secretary, you may be interested to know that the Care Inspectorate guidance for children and young people's services on the inclusion of trans and non-binary young people makes the following statement, and I quote, "The provision of gendered facilities such as toilets is social convention. There is no law in Scotland about this." Does the Scottish Government agree with the Care Inspectorate's statement?
Cabinet Secretary.
The provision of the Equality Act 2010, including those relating to single-sex spaces and the general exception in relation to communal residential accommodation, apply to Scotland. Any issues of how these are operating in particular situations are matters for the EHRC as the enforcement body for the Act and for the relevant public body concerned.
Tess White.
No. It's a ludicrous and frankly chilling statement from a regulator that's supposed to protect Scotland's most vulnerable children and young people. There are massive, massive safeguarding issues arising from this reckless guidance. But it's not just the Care Inspectorate. The Scottish Prison Service is in the spotlight once again because it's allowing trans-identifying prison officers to perform intimate and utterly unacceptable rub-down searches of vulnerable women visiting the prison estate. Violent trans-identifying men can still be housed in the female prison estate in certain circumstances. So will this Scottish Government finally do the decent thing, lay down the law on Scotland's public bodies and tell them to withdraw this ill-informed and insidious guidance which allows the rights of male-bodied individuals to transcend those of women and girls?
Cabinet Secretary. With regards to the Care Inspectorate part of the member's question, everyone in Scotland deserves to receive safe and high-quality care that meets their needs and respects their rights and choices. And it is very important that the rights of and the rights to all of those involved are considered and respected in everything that is done. With relation to the Scottish Prison Service, the member will also be aware that new rules were introduced in 2023 which provides for visitors. The law states that visitors are searched in accordance with Rule 106 of those rules. Consent is required. At Rule 106(3), it is made clear that general searching of the person or their clothing is to be done by an officer of the same gender as the visitor, and it must be completed as quickly and as decently as possible, and the use of force is not permitted. And I would also stress at 106(4) that a visitor who is being searched cannot be required to remove, and a search must not involve the removal of any clothing other than an outer coat, jacket, headgear, gloves or footwear.
Ash Regan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, another week, another egregious breach of women and girls' human rights. This time impacting on vulnerable children in care and women on the prison estate, many of whom will have trauma backgrounds. Does the government not understand that by promoting this illegal and illiterate gender self-ID policies that override and nullify sex-based safeguarding through handing out access all area passes, that this is completely unacceptable? When is the government going to wake up to their obligations to ensure that public bodies follow the law, ensure safeguarding and women's human rights are upheld before the next scandal unfolds, probably next week?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as I've made clear on many occasions now, the Scottish Government strongly supports the separate and single-sex exemptions in the 2010 Equality Act, which can allow for people to be excluded when this is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. I also mentioned in my original answer the very important guidance that is published by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and indeed their work on the statutory codes of practice, including that work to update that. And I look forward to the Commission continuing that work and for that updated code of practice to be published.
Thank you. That concludes topical questions. The next item of business is about to follow. I'll allow a moment or two for front benches to organise. The next item of business is a debate on motion 16839 in the name of Mairi Gougeon on protecting and growing Scotland's iconic food and drink sector. I'd be grateful if members who wish to speak in the debate were to press their request to speak buttons now. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move the motion. Up to 15 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is vital that, as a Parliament, we take time to discuss our iconic food and drink and how we can help protect and grow the sector in an ever-changing world. Our food and drink sector is hugely important to Scotland. It's a success story that we are determined to build on. It's one of the bedrocks of the Scottish economy, a £15 billion industry. We have over 17,000 businesses employing around 129,000 people that touches communities the length and breadth of Scotland. Jobs in the industry account for 4.9% of total employment in Scotland, and I know that every member here across the chamber will be able to give examples of businesses within their own constituencies who contribute to these figures. Generations of farmers, fishermen, brewers, distillers and chefs work tirelessly every day with passion and skill to create some of the best produce in the world. Our processors, wholesalers and grocers also play a vital role in showcasing and bringing the very best of that produce to us. I want to thank all of those businesses who contribute to the success of the sector. We are determined to work with you and support you together in partnership. Now, today, I want to recognise the contribution of everyone involved in keeping this dynamic, complex and highly interconnected sector operating, supplying food and drink to the people of Scotland and beyond each and every day. Now, I know how important it is to work together with industry to help them thrive, and that's why the Scottish Government continues to support the Scotland Food and Drink Partnership to deliver the strategy Sustaining Scotland, Supplying the World. So far, we've provided £10 million of funding towards this industry-led strategy for the sector, which was launched in 2023. The Scotland Food and Drink Partnership is a really unique and valuable asset, and I can't stress enough how much I value the collaboration that we have between Government and our key partners to further the interests of the sector. I'd like to highlight some of the work that's been taken forward through the strategy and the partnership. Now, 10 years ago, we launched the Food and Drink Export Plan, supported by Scotland Food and Drink, AHDB, Opportunity North East, Salmon Scotland, Scottish Development International, Seafood Scotland and Quality Meat Scotland. Under this plan, we have in-market specialists placed in key markets around the world to champion Scottish products to buyers there, working with teams back in Scotland to help producers take advantage of export opportunities. I meet with the in-market specialists regularly, where I hear firsthand the really creative and exciting work that they're doing to promote Scottish products across the globe. This work is fundamental to growth of the sector. Exports of Scottish food and drink were worth £7.6 billion in 2023, making up around a third of the total amount of food and drink exports from the UK. With Scottish salmon accounting for £844 million of exports last year and Scotch whisky £5.6 billion. Now, alongside the quality and the integrity of our produce, one of our most valuable assets is, of course, the soft power of Scotland and our brand. Across the globe, there is a wealth of support and friendliness directed towards our nation, and we really have to harness those ties of friendship to help grow our exports and thus underpin good, high-quality jobs and prosperity in our economy. Yes, I'd be happy to.
Rachel Hamilton.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking an intervention, and I wish her well in the future. On the point about being competitive in a European and global market, does the Cabinet Secretary think it would be to the benefit of Scotland's farmers to bring forward precision breeding technology so that they can too become competitive?
Cabinet Secretary.
On our first point, I just want to thank the member and assure her I'm not going anywhere yet. And on the second point there, in relation to gene editing and the technology there, now we want to have a wide-ranging conversation around that, which is why we've committed, we're actually holding a round table next week, because this is about a wider discussion with academics, with our farming industry, also with wider civil society as well, so that we can go through this. We don't want to rush it in the way that the UK government did. Now, returning to my comments, Presiding Officer, we are also focusing on the opportunities that are presented by the UK market. Now, through Meet the Buyer events, linking up producers and suppliers and placing experts in Scottish products with national retailers and wholesalers, we are growing sales of Scottish products. For the first time, we have an in-market specialist based in London who's already making a difference with new relationships formed and business already won. Closer to home, the work in Scotland continues. We know that Scottish consumers want to be able to buy more Scottish products, and indeed I know that this is a keen area of interest for MSPs across this chamber. The Scottish Government supports work in both the retail and out-of-home markets to achieve this. And that's why today I'm delighted to announce that we will be providing another £100,000 as part of the Scotland Food and Drink Partnership Regional Food Fund as of the 1st of April this year. We already have a well-recognised and established sector. However, this fund provides further support by encouraging small businesses to thrive and foster collaboration amongst producers and food groups. Now, through really remarkable initiatives like this, we are providing those small projects the opportunity to promote and really showcase their regional goods. As we've considered the success from the last decade and as we prepare to launch this next round of the fund, we reflect on past rounds where we have witnessed so much good work. This includes the creation of food and drink trails, seafood festivals, small producers expanding their reach, local distilleries crafting unique events and online campaigns from promoting soft fruits to Scottish tea to food tourism opportunities that really have brought people together over that shared love of food. Scotland has an amazing reputation for quality food and drink, which we really want to capitalise on. And with this in mind, last year saw the launch of the new Naturally Scottish branding. That's used both here at home and within export markets. It really is a fantastic articulation, I think, of our industry, the people, the places, and the pride and passion involved in all that we do. Now, another key piece of work that I want to touch on today, and I'm proud that we're taking forward, is in making Scotland a good food nation. Now, this government is committed to ensuring that everyone in Scotland has reliable and dignified access to safe, nutritious, affordable, enjoyable, sustainable food. We want to have a thriving food culture and a prosperous and innovative food and drink sector. And as I hope have already been outlined today, there is so much to be proud of regarding Scottish food. Yes.
Sandish Gulhani.
Thank you for taking the intervention. Given that the ambition is to have everyone able to have quality good food, when is that going to come into the NHS?
Cabinet Secretary.
The work of health is, of course, integral to the work of the Good Food Nation, and that's really what the plan is about. It's about us publishing that plan and setting out, as a Scottish Government, how we're not working in silos, because we know that food policy touches all these critical areas, and how we are trying to address some of the key challenges that we face. Now, the Good Food Nation Act provides the framework for our future food strategy. It places duties on Scottish ministers, local authorities and health boards to produce plans of their policies in relation to food and set out what they're going to do to make those plans real. And we really look forward to publishing our first National Good Food Nation plan later this year, setting out our high-level aspirations for a good food nation and outlining how we plan to embed long-term strategic transformation into decision-making about food policy. Now, there is so much to be positive about in terms of growth in the sector, but all of this, of course, is in spite of some of the very key challenges the industry has faced, not least Brexit, which has been an unmitigated disaster for our food and drink businesses. Now, very few days pass without a Brexit-related challenge being highlighted to me, whether that's lack of labour to impacts on exports. Now, this government remains firmly committed to a future within the EU single market and the benefits that would come from that for our producers and consumers. This industry, our food and drink sector, perhaps more than others, faces the pressures of rising costs caused by Brexit and ongoing conflicts across the world, the complexities of climate change and the ever-evolving demands of consumers. Which brings me, importantly, to food security. Now, until recently, I think it's fair to say that we'd all taken food security for granted, thanks to the stability of the global system of trade. In recent years, things have become more volatile, which means we're putting more of our efforts into ensuring food security in Scotland. Now, this includes providing that continued support to our primary producers to help them manage that volatility and produce food sustainably. Unfortunately, providing that stability and certainty is made all the more difficult as a result of having no multi-year budget allocation support from the UK Government. Now, we've already had to act urgently on a number of occasions, including the outbreak of war in Ukraine, where, amongst other things, energy prices and other availability of some key commodities were significantly affected. Now, with industry, we set up a short-life task force and implemented its recommendations to increase the resilience of the sector. In government, we strengthened our relationships with key partners around the world, recognising that food security is a global issue and one that we cannot address alone. Yes.
Finlay Carson.
I very much appreciate the Cabinet Secretary giving away, but given what we heard from farming stakeholders and members of ARIOB in last week's Rural Affairs Committee that suggested that the Scottish Government didn't speak the language of farmers, and also real concerns about the progress we made, what faith should we have in any policies going forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
We are intent on working with our farmers and crofters in developing future policy, and I think that we're only in the position that we're in, and I understand that some people would like us to go further, faster, but I think in terms of trying to get things right and working with our key partners, I think we are making good progress, and I think it's certainly a lot better than I think the travesties that we're seeing emerge down south. Now, food resilience and food security is not something we can achieve alone, and in June 2024, I hosted an international food summit, gathering representatives from key international organisations and Scottish stakeholders to discuss the role of local solutions in addressing international problems. This was a hugely successful summit, and those who attended were keen to continue that engagement. And to that end, later this year, we're going to host a conference focusing on Scotland's research and evidence around food security and inviting exchange to foster those relationships. Scotland is eager to play its part and show leadership in international efforts to tackle issues that are affecting food systems. Now, with a limited amount of control over these risks, it's more important now than ever that we work with the sectors and with other governments to ensure that, while the sector is supported to grow sustainably, we carefully consider food security and, at a minimum, do not unintentionally reduce our food security. It must be recognised as a priority at all levels of government in order to get ahead of the curve and bake in the right choices, because if we don't, we could inadvertently reduce the availability, affordability, quality or stability of our national food supply. This is why I brought the issue to Cabinet recently to consider how food security and food system resilience can be considered as part of the agenda in every portfolio across Scottish Government, and that work is ongoing. Sometimes, however, the threats to industry come from closer to home. Recently, we've seen an application being lodged with the UK Government to provide geographical indication status for English whisky. Now, this has caused some real concern from industry around watering down of the definition of single malt. Although they are a reserved area, geographical indications are a highly coveted signifier of quality and provenance. Yes.
Daniel Johnson.
Would the Cabinet Secretary acknowledge that Darren Jones in the House of Commons just, I think, the week before last said that there is, and I quote, that I can confirm that we will not be watering down the definition of single malt whisky. That is a direct quote. Would you just acknowledge that, please?
Cabinet Secretary.
Now, while those verbal assurances were offered in the UK Parliament chamber that day, the consultation on the English whisky GI is still very much open, and we have received no confirmation from the UK Government that they're intending to change course. Now, Scotland is lucky in the breadth of protected products coming from all over our islands and mainland, be that Arbroath Smokies, Stornoway Black Pudding, Orkney Island Cheddar. Our products are sought after and should be afforded the protection from imitation that they deserve. The GI scheme must exist to protect products individually and as a collective, but let me be crystal clear. Any attempts to include apparently comparable products, but with lower production processes, not only undermines the GI scheme, but also consumer confidence both here and in our vital export markets. I know there's been significant interest in the recent application, and given the reserved nature of the application process, I would continue to encourage anyone with concerns to respond to that consultation, which is open until the 20th of May. Yes.
Emma Harper.
So the issue of the Scotch whisky definition being changed, or to include a definition for English whisky, actually has concerns for me as well. Would the Cabinet Secretary just give us a confirmation of what our understanding is, what the proposal actually is?
Absolutely, and as I highlighted in my previous response to Daniel Johnson just there, this is still very much a live issue. It certainly hasn't been resolved, and that's certainly not what we're hearing from DEFRA, who are dealing with this application, and the consultation is still very much open. So that's where I would encourage members. I'm sorry, I have taken a number of interventions, and I really have to make progress. I'm just drawing towards a close. Now, there is another important matter that I wanted to... I realise I'm rapidly running out of time, but I think it is important to touch on today, which is, of course, other barriers to trade and how we can potentially see progress there. Because I've mentioned already the impact of global instability on food and drink businesses. And, of course, the impact of Brexit continues to be felt at the border through the post-Brexit regime of checks and controls under the Border Target Operating Model, which was published in 2023. Now, overall, additional trade barriers and red tape faced by our exporters are continuing to hamper business and trade flow with the EU, and we know that there are also significant issues around imports. Now, the new UK Government has indicated a willingness to open negotiations with the EU on an SPS and veterinary agreement to remove the need for many of these checks, and the Scottish Government stands ready to work together to achieve the best possible results to protect Scotland's interests. Now, in drawing to a close, Presiding Officer, it's clear that our food and drink industry is one that's vulnerable to global currents, be that Brexit, geopolitical issues and the tragic conflicts taking place around the world. Yet it remains an industry with enormous potential and great ambition. We're doing much in Scotland to support this exciting sector, and the future is positive. And in safeguarding our industry, we have to secure its long-term sustainability and empower it to thrive in face of these challenges. And I can assure members that this Government will do everything in its power to do that. So I'm therefore pleased to move the motion in my name and would ask members across the chamber to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I now call on Tim Eagle to speak to and move Amendment 16839.2 up to 11 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I just remind members of my register of interest as a small farmer, and I move the amendment in my name. Writing a speech on Scotland's food and drink, Presiding Officer, is no easy task, for Scotland creates a vast range of world-renowned food and drink, from the fresh catch of the day across our coastal regions to spirits, fruits and more. Fruits from Angus growers in Fife, Angus and Perthshire, Cullen skink with fresh caught fish from Shetland, the iconic Iron Brew from AG Bar, Glasgow, or Bonaccord drinks with their big natural flavours. Aberdeen Angus steak produced to the highest welfare standards on the rolling hills of Aberdeenshire, or for vegetarians, McSween's of Edinburgh's have a range of vegan and vegetarian options. Perhaps eaten surrounded with chips from the Real Fresh Chip Company in Fife. We should be proud of Scotland's leading role in potato production, with Scotland exporting over 92,000 tonnes of high health status seed potatoes. And don't forget, east of Scotland growers supply a wide range of quality vegetables. Locals can delight in one of Harry Gow's delicious cakes from the Highlands, ice cream from Arran Dairies, All's delicious cheesecakes, Reed's of Caithness cakes, or Rowan Glen yoghurts. And if that does not fill us up, perhaps, Presiding Officer, we can all sit back and enjoy some of Angus Robertson's cultural delights with a packet of Mackay's crisps, a cheese board with Orkney cheddar, some smoked salmon from Stornoway Smokehouse, all washed down with a wee dram of Scotch whisky. But don't forget to add a drop of water, which is essential according to Jack Gemmell at Shivers Brothers. I can create a stunning tour through Scotland's iconic, fresh, high-quality food and drink sector, produced by companies employing thousands of staff, contributing 14.6% GVA of total UK food and drink manufacturing, 31.3% of total UK food and drink exports. The Scottish whisky industry itself makes up £3 in every £100 of Scottish GVA, totalling 77% of Scotland's food and drinks exports, worth £5.3 billion to the Scottish economy. It pains me to see that the industry was startled by the GI announcement down in England, and I know my colleagues will touch on that further later on. I had the pleasure recently of visiting Scotland's Rural College New Vertical Farm, which is innovating new ways to support food production and security. SRUC opened the £1.8 million facility in January, dedicated to teaching students about growing crops quicker with higher nutritional value whilst using less water. I am confident that this will play its part in the future food security in Scotland, and I wish SRCU well with the project. It is important to me that we start on positives, because behind the businesses mentioned above are our constituents, our friends, perhaps our family, who play their role every day in supporting Scotland's food and drink economy. But, Presiding Officer, whilst being proud to talk about Scotland's food and drink sector, it does not take away the challenges that do exist. I've already had companies contacting me about Labour's national insurance increases, which are causing real concern. On top of already increased costs, this was a bitter blow for many businesses and will cost jobs in the sector. In January, the Scottish Association of Meat Wholesalers raised concerns about a potential shortage of red meat supply due to falling numbers of cattle. Scott Walker, the Chief Executive, expressed serious concern, warning that decline could be felt on retail shelves in the future. The Scottish Fishermen's Association have warned that the industry risks being crushed because of planned significant growth to floating offshore wind power in Scottish waters and the UK government's ambition to reset relationships with the EU. Fishermen tell me of concerns over current arrangements for non-UK boats in our waters, with dangers of overfishing and bad practice. Infrastructure is required in many areas. In my own area, nearly 40 rural jobs will be lost when a rural food producer, New World Foods in Forres, closes on April the 30th. The factory owner, Valio Foods UK, cited a number of logistical challenges presented by the site's location, which have made it increasingly difficult to maintain cost efficiencies. I don't claim to know full details, but what might a dual A9 or A96 have done to keep these essential jobs in remote rural areas like Forres? Transport, along with energy prices and labour, remain key issues for the industry, issues that must be addressed with clarity and with vision by the Scottish Government. The motion from the Cabinet Secretary today calls for cross-party support. In respect of talking up our food and drink sector, standing side by side to protect Scottish whisky or shout loudly about our products, I do welcome that cross-party consensus. But my job in Parliament is to point out where mistakes are made by the SNP government, when things are not right and when more needs to be done. The decision to not pass on the business rate relief support to hospitality was a huge mistake. That lack of business rate support has stifled growth and has deferred investment. The deposit return scheme caused confusion and worry across the drink sector, ultimately moving to a long-term pause, but not before costing the industry significant sums of money. The SNP's failure to factor in cost and the UK Internal Markets Act was a real concern. The Scottish Government are yet to produce a finalised Good Food Nation plan, but I, like many, will be eagerly anticipating it later on this year. Just last week, the Rural Affairs Committee, as picked up on by Finlay Carson a moment ago, heard from farmers and industry representatives that changes to agricultural policy are too slow, and key information is not getting to the ground. The Minister might look at me, but it is true. That's what they said last week. There remains for me a lack of urgency in terms of future agricultural support, with no clear accepted plan to restore livestock numbers and support food production, or encourage new entrants and young farmers. The SNP delivered cuts to college funding across Scotland is causing a recruitment crisis and a skills shortage, with 8,000 less places in the last year alone, according to the Scottish Funding Council. Delays to the dualling of the A9, little progress on roads like A83, Rest and Be Thankful, and never-ending issues with ferries are all causing significant challenges to the food and drinks businesses across rural Scotland and on our islands. If Scotland is to achieve its 2030 goal for farming, fishing, food and drink to be Scotland's most valuable industry, recognised and at home and abroad as a model of collaboration and a world leader in responsible, profitable growth, then it needs far more, far clearer government support. I would never deny challenges that have come from Brexit, COVID or conflict around the world. But I was interested to read in the Spice report on Scotland's exports policy and statistics that seafood exports have not declined markedly following the UK's exit from the EU in aggregate. But there has been a considerable switch in terms of the markets and products being exported. That includes increases in exports to France, the Netherlands, Poland and Lithuania. That's welcome news. Markets do change over time, and I am aware that some parts of the industry are progressing new, exciting opportunities in new markets around the world. Interesting, in the same report, beverage exports have also shown no sign of change since leaving the EU. Now, I want to quickly mention gene editing. I worry that too often people see the word gene and immediately picture thousands of genetically engineered giant lettuces, or it conjures images of crops taking over entire ecosystems. I accept that there are concerns over genetically modified organisms, but gene editing, in my understanding, is a very different thing. Using well-known methods to modify existing genetic material in a way that can yield more beneficial outcomes, this technology could help tweak the performance of crops to help with disease-resistant, drought tolerance, or help produce higher yields. The Scottish agricultural industry has called itself for the adoption of precision breeding technology and has highlighted its potential to strengthen food security and address climate change. Organisations such as the Agricultural Industries Confederation Scotland and NFUS have urged the Scottish Government to align with recent precision breeding legislation already enacted in England. As with all new technologies, a careful, considered approach is always safest. But there is a difference between gene editing and genetic modification, and perhaps it's about time the Scottish Government thought about its use again in Scotland. I hope we all want to see a thriving, successful food... Absolutely.
Finlay Carson.
I appreciate my colleague taking an intervention. New Zealand is making significant strides in updating its gene editing technology, along with Spain, France, Italy and the Netherlands, actively supporting new rules, in stark contrast to Scotland's position. Do you believe that the Scottish Government is once again dragging their feet and going to end up failing our farmers, growers and researchers?
Yeah. I don't believe one way or t'other, but always through the chair, Mr Carson. Tim Eagle, I can give you the time.
Well, I always like to show that the Scottish Government are dragging their feet, and certainly on things like agricultural policy they have been. But I agree. I do think on this, I think if we're looking towards the future in an uncertain world, then gene editing is, I think, a good option for us. And it is something that the government should be actively looking at. And that is why countries around the world are looking at this. It's a much safer method of doing it, and we should be doing it. I hope we all want to see a thriving, successful food and drink sector. In the uncertain world we live in, we must be ready to fight for our producers. The risks of tariffs have never been so strong. The importance of diplomacy, acutely important at this time. My Scottish Conservative colleagues and I stand with the food and drink industry. In 2024, we promised to increase the UK-wide farming budget by £1 billion to allow farmers to spend more money on domestic food production. We would extend the seasonal worker visa scheme for agricultural labourers and support a review of the skilled workers visa for the fishing sector. We would look to strike the right balance between conservation and food security and support new entrants getting into farming and fishing to ensure our food security for generations. We would work for and with businesses, knowing the importance of supporting our valuable private sector. Presiding Officer, there is much to shout about, to be proud about in supporting Scottish food and drink. But there is also much to be done to further support this vital Scottish industry, from its primary producers to global corporations. My thanks to all those who work in this vital sector across our Scottish communities, and here's to a successful year ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. I now call on Rhoda Grant to speak to and move Amendment 16839.1 up to 9 minutes. Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In Scotland, we're blessed with world-recognised quality food and drink, from Scottish whisky, Scottish salmon, Orkney Gold, and of course Stornoway Black Pudding, and there are many more examples I could quote from the Highlands and Islands alone. And this debate gives members the opportunity to list the wonderful produce from their own constituencies and regions. However, this year there are more serious matters to debate. The talk of trade wars and tariffs create uncertainty for our food and drinks industry. We need to build trade agreements that allow our produce to be sold across the world, but that must never be at the detriment of our standards. It's not just about maintaining standards, though. The quality and quantity of Scottish produce is something to celebrate. The renowned status of our food and drink must be harnessed and promoted internationally. Despite claiming to represent Scotland, the SNP have not done a good job on exporting Scotland's produce to the world. And that's why Scottish Labour's Brand Scotland campaign is so important. It will drive and boost investment and exports. Brand Scotland utilises UK government infrastructure to focus on investments and trade strategies that are good for Scotland. This enhances Scotland's international presence and drives economic growth. I was going to...
Briefly, Rachel Hamilton.
I think there is concern around the national insurance contribution. You talk so highly about our produce, but the British Growers Association has said that fruit and veg could rise by 10 and 12% because of that. What would you say to your UK colleagues about this national insurance contribution?
Please, a reminder that all comments should be through the chair. Rhoda Grant.
Yes. My colleagues have suggested a bit of humility about clearing up the mess left by the last UK government should be had. Presiding Officer, it's clear that fostering international investment in key sectors is central to support of our food and drink sector. And having a good relationship with the Scotland office and the extensive network of UK embassies worldwide can effectively promote Scottish produce and services.
Cabinet Secretary, briefly.
I think I have to take issue with some of the points that have been made by Rhoda Grant in relation to the Brand Scotland initiative that she talks about, because as I outlined in my speech today, and I hope that Rhoda Grant would welcome, the investment that we spent in the Scotland Food and Export Plan, all the work that we're doing with our in-market specialists, and does she also realise that trade, of course, is a reserved policy matter, and the damage that had been done in the trade deals by the previous UK government, who sold us down the river and took us out of the biggest single market of the EU.
Can I advise the Chamber there is no time in hand, therefore interventions should be brief. I'll give you the time back though, Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And that's it. There is another plan, but we need to see action. The Scottish Government motion talks about the protection of English whisky as posing a risk to Scottish whisky, and the Cabinet Secretary seeks to cause a disagreement where it doesn't exist. As Daniel Johnston said, the UK Government have made it clear that they will not support any moves to change the definition of single malt, which should provide reassurance to the Chamber. That said, I'm not taking any more interventions. I'm running out of time. That said, Scottish whisky already competes in a global whisky market, and we more than hold our own with whiskies from Ireland, Taiwan, Japan, to mention only a few. The Scottish Government must also publicise and promote our industry. It needs to highlight that our whisky industry is at the forefront of trying to gain net zero. Whisky being distilled today will not be consumed for at least 4 years at the very earliest, and the best will age for 10, 12 or 18 years to receive the premium price. These whiskies will be sold in a world that is very different to the one we have today. Consumers will want to know not only the provenance, but the carbon footprint of what they are drinking. The whisky industry cannot do that in a vacuum. They work with farmers who produce the raw material. They look to renewables for their heat production, and they utilise our sometimes all too copious amounts of water. There are real opportunities for other industries and communities to work with them, to learn and gain from their innovation and experience. Our Scottish salmon is another iconic product. Its worldwide recognition and trade benefits to Scotland should not be underestimated. And that's why the governance and oversight of the industry must improve. The Scottish Government has done nothing to streamline the regulation of the industry. It's clunky and time-consuming, and it's little wonder that the industry is largely owned by multinationals, because they are the only ones with deep enough pockets to deal with our governance structures. The Scottish Government need to provide better governance and transparency to allow the industry to flourish while protecting our environment and reputation. Our amendment highlights the Food and Drink Federation estimate that the sector needs nearly 35,000 new recruits by 2031 to fill their skills gap. With universities in crisis and colleges cut to the bone, it's difficult to see how we can, in any industry, provide the trained workforce required. The Scottish Government must ensure our young people are equipped with the skills the industry demands. With the motion highlighting the importance of rural and island communities to the sector, there has to be better local vocational and educational opportunities to ensure young people can have the option to gain skills close to home. Future skills have to be part of an industrial strategy. In devising that strategy, we need to ask ourselves, what will the food and drink businesses of the future look like? How do our workers acquire the skills that will be needed to continue to capitalise on our excellent products and promote that excellence? Many of our primary food producers work. I have taken a number of interventions and I am running out of time, so I need to continue. Many of our primary food producers work in the islands and in rural Scotland. However, we know the Scottish Government are not building homes in rural Scotland, and this means that the workforce is depleted and young people are driven into our cities. Producers need good, reliable routes to market to ensure the quality and freshness of their product as well. That counts whether you're transporting goods around the world or within Scotland. Our island's fish processors have a daily battle to try and get produce onto the mainland and beyond. A ferry that has been cancelled due to yet another breakdown plays havoc with that. It forces these industries to consider to move to the mainland, and this will decimate our island economies. There are jobs in fish processing, but these processors take their product from a myriad of small boats and then need to have their catches transported to the mainland for them. These boats are far too small to land in mainland ports, and therefore if the processors move out, these boats have nowhere to sell their catch. Our shellfish, again, is recognised for its excellent the world over. And to keep that reputation, it needs to be fresh to gain the national and international benefit we need. And therefore, we need to make it fairer, easier for the whole industry to work and trade. And, Presiding Officer, all that said, it's sad that in a country such as ours, renowned for its produce, that many of our citizens live in food poverty. It's simply wrong that people are forced to get their nutrition through food banks, and I long for the day that the need for food banks is a thing of the past. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, we are rightly proud of our reputation for excellence within the food and drink industries. To sustain and grow our food and drink industry domestically as well as internationally, businesses need modern and fit-for-purpose transportation networks. They also need skilled employees to grow their operations, and these employees need homes to live in, to nurture communities and the workers of the future. To promote our food and drink, we need to protect its reputation and excellence while ensuring we meet net zero. Reputations need to be actively maintained and sustained. We need to ensure our food and drink sector has the government backing it needs, and I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. Ms Grant, just a reminder to the Chamber, there is now no time in hand. I would encourage any interventions to be brief and through the Chair. And with that, I call Ariane Burgess up to 6 minutes. Ms Burgess.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to begin by extending my best wishes for the future to the Cabinet Secretary in light of her announcement that she is stepping down next year, and it's been a pleasure to work with her to ensure a thriving future for our rural communities, and I look forward to continuing to do so in the time that we have left. I welcome the opportunity to discuss Scottish food and drink, and I support the acknowledgement in the Government's motion that the sector is important to rural and island communities, and the idea that food and drink play a key role in Scotland's global reputation. And I also support Labour's motion, particularly because it identifies the need to fill skills gaps and recognises the importance of people to the food and drink sector. However, I would welcome clarity, because I think already in this debate we haven't heard it yet, over what's happening with the whisky designation, because both motions appear to be contradictory, and certainly that's not been cleared up so far in my mind in the discussion so far today. While I believe that the UK Government needs to be more respectful of Scottish produce, I want to point out that food and drink brings many things to the table beside economic benefits. Not only is it key to our very survival, it's a cultural glue that binds us all together. It's vital to the health of the nation, and a well-nourished population would take the strain off the NHS, and if managed properly, sharing out the many benefits of food and drink production across Scotland can stop rural depopulation. The sector also has a major role to play when it comes to tackling the climate and nature emergencies, which is why the Scottish Greens have repeatedly called for multi-year funding that helps to deliver what's set out in the Good Food Nation Act, implements a food production skills pipeline, and supports the transition to regenerative production methods. And as we've heard already today, I'm also incredibly proud that we have a thriving array of food and drink businesses and initiatives across Scotland. And a couple of examples that I can think of: Grampian Grazers in Aberdeenshire and the Orkney Cheese Company in Orkney. They are doing fantastic work to produce high-quality food while acknowledging the environment and animal welfare. We've heard about time, and I've got quite a lot to say. Apologies. But I can't stand here today and say that all the primary food producers in my region fill me with pride. My region hosts the single biggest risk to the reputation of Scottish food and drink: fish farms. The UK and Scottish governments are willing to support this industry with taxpayer money, £17 million since 2021, according to a report in the Daily Record today. And they do this no matter how much pollution it produces, or how much ecological damage it causes, or the appalling animal suffering it creates. The industry's arguments always boil down to the economic good the industrial-scale farming supposedly brings. And this industry and the multinational corporations that run it do not have Scotland's best interests at heart. They operate solely in the interest of their shareholders. And when it comes to job creation, only 253 full-time roles in my region have been created over the last 35 years. And along with that, they wreak environmental destruction that harms other marine sectors and our coastal communities. Allowing fish farms to continue business as usual is simply not an option. If we want Scottish exports to continue to be viewed as quality, produced to high environmental and animal welfare standards, we need to act now to cut the high levels of pollution, sea lice and fish mortalities these farms produce. On mortality alone, no other farming sector would accept this level of loss, and neither should we, which is why I've been calling on the government to introduce an immediate pause on fish farm expansion, so that we can send a clear message to businesses, our export partners and the people of our nation that Scotland will not allow those with a complete disregard for our environment and communities to operate within our borders. Fish farming is not the only threat to the well-being of Scotland's food and drink sector. Brexit has created labour shortages and reams of red tape. At the same time, the UK government continues to cede control over food policy to the supermarkets, an approach that has already led to decades-long races to the bottom in terms of price, quality and variety, leaving farmers to operate on wafer-thin margins and creating a farcical situation that sees public subsidies being passed through farmers to private supermarket chains that turn over billions of pounds a year. We've legislated for farmers to move to regenerative, sustainable agricultural systems, and these are the very practices that will enable them to face huge climate change challenges that we and they are going to face over the coming decades. Yet with wafer-thin margins, it's no wonder that they are hesitant to move to these practices. The UK government also has much to answer for when it comes to trade deals it has signed. Not only have these undermined our nation's primary food producers, they've also exported our carbon emissions to countries that produce food using methods that pay little heed to animal welfare and the environment. To conclude, with greater control over the direction of Scotland's food and drink policy, the Government and this Parliament can change the state of affairs and move to a system that delivers not only for our environment and the climate, but also for the people of Scotland.
We really do have no time in hand, and members will need to stick to their speaking allocations. Beatrice Wishart, up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to discuss and praise Scotland's iconic food and drink sector as we experience old and new threats. The Government motion highlights new risks to tariffs, and we can already see the impact on global markets as Donald Trump embarks on new tariffs. Tariffs and barriers to trade only serve to make people and countries poorer. Scotland's producers do not deserve or need the impact that tariffs would bring, having already felt the disruption of COVID and Brexit. Changes to the freedom of movement has impacted workforce recruitment and retention. Recent figures from the Food and Drink Federation highlight a 34% decline in overall food export volume to the EU. Though Scotch whisky remains a popular export to the bloc, and we should be wary of the risks of the proposal for an English whisky geographical indication. New trade deals in the post-Brexit era bring concern about lower standards of welfare in food production, with products like chlorinated chicken from the USA. And the new agreement with New Zealand has made lamb imports cheaper, and it competes with the seasonal production of Scotch lamb. At home, the cost of living crisis continues with tight household budgets, and more are pushed towards the use of ultra-processed food, food banks and similar support. The Scottish Government's Good Food Nation Bill was passed early on in this parliamentary session to improve access to food, sustainability in the sector and people's well-being. We're still waiting for the final Good Food Nation plan following consultation on the draft, and perhaps the Cabinet Secretary could update us on this when she summates. We also face the twin emergencies of climate change and biodiversity loss, both of which could have a massive impact on our food and drink sector. Fruit growers need the humble bee for pollination, and threats to honeybee populations from disease and parasites leave the sector vulnerable. As others have said, salmon is Scotland's iconic fish. The salmon industry employs 2,500 people directly and around 10,000 people through the supply chain that reaches all parts of Scotland. I've heard directly from salmon farmers of their commitment to the welfare and husbandry of their fish, including from some working in my own constituency in Shetland. Salmon exports from the Northern Isles and other remote parts of Scotland contribute millions to the national economy, and there's been significant investment in modernisation and innovation by the industry. Recent UK government's trade statistics highlight that 100,000 tonnes of Scottish salmon was exported to 48 countries around the world, worth $844 million in 2024. Have we got time? No, sorry, I need to get through this. Scotland ranks third globally in terms of Atlantic salmon production and produces 6% of global production. It is a great success story, but there are challenges to salmon farming, including rising sea temperatures and jellyfish blooms. But, Presiding Officer, in my view, however, the biggest threat to salmon farming comes from those who are ideologically opposed to the sector itself. Those who would see an end to Scotland's salmon farming industry would cause devastation to rural and island economies, including Shetland, where it employs around 400 people. It would ultimately lead to depopulation and decimate some of the most fragile communities in Scotland. Fishing is culturally and economically important in many of Scotland's island and coastal communities. My members' debate a few weeks ago, the first dedicated fisheries debate in the Scottish Parliament for years, highlighted the impact of spatial squeeze, displacement from traditional fishing grounds due to an increasing developments like offshore renewables. We should be embracing what we can catch around Scotland, as it's a means of supplying a low-carbon source of high protein with reduced food miles and food security. With any kind of reduction in Scotland's food production, we will see an impact on those who make it possible to get food to the table. Road hauliers play a vital role in Scotland's food and drink economy. They move goods, including perishables like fresh seafood, across the country to meet onward connections to global markets. Those perishables need appropriate packaging, like the boxes produced by Shetland firm Thulcraft, which are used to ship salmon and mussels. And over 80% of Scotland's mussels are grown in Shetland. We should be doing what we can to support all these industries and producers as they face increasing costs and uncertainties, as well as support them to decarbonise and become more sustainable for the future. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. We now move to the open debate. Again, time is tight. I call first Christine Graham to be followed by Richard Hamilton. Up to 6 minutes. Ms Graham.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I very much welcome the opportunity to speak in this debate, and in due course I will refer to some of the local industries in food and drink in my constituency, which I'm sure other members will do, and if not, they ought to. That said, I think we, the Scottish public, perhaps underestimate the value in hard cash in exports and indeed the quality of our homegrown produce across this wide and varied sector. Soft fruits, a large variety of tatties, neeps, seafood, cheeses, our craft beers and lagers, and of course our whisky. By the way, what Sir Keir Starmer was thinking when suggesting changing the definition of a single malt just to help English distilleries, I don't know. Indeed, was he thinking of Scotland at all? I have a feeling like Margaret Thatcher, whom he admires, he just doesn't, quotes, get Scotland, close quotes. Oh, of course.
Daniel Johnson, briefly.
I thank the member for giving. Maybe it's because he prioritises whisky, which is why he's prioritised the trade deal with India, whisky's biggest market, which currently is a 150% tariff. Surely that shows the emphasis that he places on whisky, does it not?
Christine Graham.
Oh, well, no, and I think I've got a lot of time for Mr John's being very wobbly ground on national insurance increases for employers, which will hurt the whisky industry as much as any other. Other moves he has made, particularly, as I will refer to, the increased employers' national insurance contribution, burdens the many small food and drink producers across rural Scotland, and they'll find it hard in competition with the big boys such as Tennants to push that cost onto the prices. Just as he should U-turn on whisky, he should repeat that on national insurance increases. Indeed, it's a bit rich for Rhoda Grant to complain about the lack of rural employees when we have that tax on jobs, leading to some being cut in our small businesses and certainly not increased. So much for building the economy. I just seem to have touched a raw nerve. I wonder why.
Who are you taking the intervention from?
Education. I'm now sitting down and yes.
Rhoda Grant, I think.
Thank you. Would Christine Graham not acknowledge that NI was actually cut for small businesses, which will have a positive impact on rural businesses?
Christine Graham.
Businesses.
I think one has to ask oneself, all the other things that Labour didn't say in their election manifesto was they didn't mention an increase in national insurance contributions from employers on top of the WASPE women, you name it, the winter fuel allowance, and now, of course, benefits. So you have a lot to answer for. I would keep quiet for the time being. And on top of that, we've got Brexit. Yes, don't mention the B word, Brexit. Hardly a cheep about this from Labour or the Tories. I wonder why. Could it be because it was never the open door to the world's markets, including the USA, but the bearer of increased regulations and red tape, increased costs? Just ask the Horticultural Trades Association, and undeniable shortages in labour workforce. Just ask the soft fruit growers who watch their year's work turn to mush in the fields. And despite warm words pre the general election from Dame Jackie Baillie, there is no progress on a rural visa pilot scheme. So B is for Brexit, T is for tariffs, because we are now at the mercy of the human wrecking ball, otherwise known as Donald Trump. Unlike political leaders, I don't need to be circumspect or canny with my words. As he levies tariffs here, there and everywhere, he disrupts the world's economy to boot. Another impact on our food and drink exports. By the way, there is and never ever was a special relationship. The Dougs in the street know that. Now, the broad background is that the sector in Scotland in 2020 generated turnover worth 15 billion, comprised of over 17,000 small businesses employing around 129,000 people, many in rural communities such as mine, which have just got time to mention a couple having taken these interventions, which really were pretty worthless. Traquair Brewery, with its beer and ales, which is exporting round the world, Broughton Ales, which has won awards from SIBA, CAMRA, UK supermarkets, Tesco, Meininger and World Beer Awards. Tempest Brewing Company, originally in a disused dairy in Kelso, now it's in my patch in the Borders, and they have a very successful tap room at their brewery for people to sample their products. Stour Brewery in Lauder, producing beers and gins. But lest you think it's all about alcohol in the Borders, and there's no problem with that, there is also Tweed Valley Venison, based in Peebles, with wild venison and game from Tweed, catchment area made into burgers and sausages, Shaw's Fine Meats and Lauder, fourth-generation retail and wholesale butchers, Alec Dalgetty and Sons, fifth-generation artisan bakery based next door to my office in Gala, with a second shop in Melrose, producer of the famous Selkirk Barrack, I suggest it's best warm with butter. And finally, to say, having had to skip some, I apologise in the sample of not being able to mention other, I suppose you're relieved, Deputy Presiding Officer, other food and drink retailers and wholesalers across the borders. But I say this again, unfortunately, to Rhoda Grant. I commend buying Scottish, and I've got breaking news for Rhoda Grant. The SNP first ran a campaign on Buy Scottish over 40 years ago. I know, I was outside the supermarkets waving flags for it, which led to supermarkets branding Scottish produce with a saltire. There are some benefits in being older.
Thank you. I now call Rachel Hamilton to be followed by Karen Adam. Up to 6 minutes. Ms Hamilton.
Thank you, and follow that, Presiding Officer. Yes, there is lots of lovely alcohol in the borders, but we're not reliant on it. Hooray to Scotland's food and drink sector. Contributes $15 billion to our economy, supporting 120,000 jobs. It's just fantastic, from Scotch whisky to Scottish beef. Agriculture and hospitality industries and all those in the supply chain are at the heart of our economies. Just last week, my colleague Finlay Carson and I had the pleasure of attending the Scottish Countryside Alliance Awards, otherwise known as the Rural Oscars. They Jim Fairley as well, and Emma Harper. They celebrated the outstanding businesses in our constituencies that keep rural communities thriving. And I was delighted to see businesses representing my own constituency, the Allerton Inn, the Gordon Arms, Anderson and Sondergaard, and the other one was Scots of Kelso, all fantastic businesses, and they just provide the very best of Scottish food and drink. But we have to address the elephant in the room, which is the current policies of the Labour and the SNP government, and which is making it harder to produce food and drink in Scotland, and economic mismanagement, neglect of rural Scotland, threatening those industries which are vital, as I say, to our rural economy. High energy costs are a huge problem when I speak to businesses in this sector, excessive bureaucracy at both local government and Holyrood level, a deeply unfair business rate system putting businesses under immense strain. But not only that, over-regulation, stifling innovation. We've seen that the government are about to have a roundtable on gene editing. I would love that to be a cross-party effort, if possible, because the Scottish Conservatives will get 100% behind that, because we want our producers to be as competitive as others and not be disadvantaged. We want people to be able to compete on a level playing field with the rest of the UK and beyond, whether it's Europe or globally. But at the same time, as has been highlighted today, we're seeing Labour decimating the future of Scottish farms, and they cannot get away with it. They cannot defend their position. It is a cruel family farm tax which could threaten up to 75,000 farms across the UK, and that would strip away the ability for farms to plan, to invest and to grow. This weekend I was with my father and my brother, and they farm on the Welsh borders. Now, they're dairy farmers, they're organic dairy farmers, they've got 350 cows, they work 24/7. They barely get a time to eat in the day. It's a hard life, and I felt quite moved by what my dad said. You know, he wasn't sure, you know, I shouldn't really be saying this, but he wasn't sure about the future of dairy. We know, even though Jim Fairley says that dairy cow numbers haven't declined, they have declined between January 24 and 25. And the reason they've declined is because it's so hard to farm these days without all these new policies that Labour are bringing in, from the national insurance contribution to the family farm tax. My father was saying that it was a hard summer last year. They produced the silage. They finished the silage because they needed to feed the cows longer. They're feeding hard feed. The price of hard feed has increased dramatically. And so, therefore, the profitability is being driven out of agriculture. And what are we without farmers? We are nothing. I'm very surprised at some of the things that the Green member Ariane Burgess has just said there. These are key components not only to our economy but to our rural economy, but they are essential because people need to eat and farmers are the suppliers of these. I'm also really concerned about the use of high quality agricultural land being put over to renewables such as solar farms to meet these net zero targets. They are absolutely not the way to go because the over-proliferation is having an impact. I met a broccoli grower just on the weekend, and he would make more money from putting grade 1 land, admittedly that was in England, over to solar panels. However, the same thing is happening in the borders, where there's an over-proliferation of applications when we don't need it. We can supply the energy demands without using all the class 1, 2 and 3 land in Scotland. But the same applies to fishermen on the spatial squeeze. I've been speaking to Elspeth MacDonald just earlier from the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. We know that the spatial squeeze is having a massive impact on fishing, and the rapid expansion of offshore wind projects, marine conservation measures and restrictive regulations. We know this because when the SNP were in collaboration with the Greens in the Butte House Agreement, they tried to shut off 50% of the Scottish seas and made a rapid U-turn. Yeah. But the Scottish Fishermen's Federation has warned that the industry risks being crushed by the sheer scale of planned developments in Scottish waters. Crushed, that's the word they used. Instead of working with the industry to strike that fair balance, the SNP seems to be intent on making life even harder for our fishermen. Scotland's food and drink sector is the backbone of our economy. And both of these parties, Labour and SNP, must rethink their horrendous and damaging policies.
Thank you, Ms Hamilton. And now call Karen Adam to be followed by Richard Leonard. Up to 6 minutes. Ms Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm really pleased to speak in this debate today, particularly to focus on Scotland's world-class seafood, which isn't just a product we sell, it's a part of who we are at the coast. For generations, our coastal communities have been built around the fishing industry, with ports like Peterhead and Fraserburgh landing some of the finest seafood in the world. And it's not just delicious, it's a sustainable, low-carbon source of protein, rich in omega-3s and vitamins that are essential for a healthy diet. And it's something that we should be immensely proud of. With 70 to 80% of our seafood being exported, our produce is recognised worldwide for its quality, and our shellfish and whitefish are sought after in some of the finest restaurants in Europe, Asia and the Middle East. Industry leaders like Jimmy Buchan of Amity Fish Company are taking our seafood to new markets, recently showcasing Scotland's produce in Dubai. At the Gulf Trade Show, the largest food expo in the world, Scottish companies secured over £1.5 million in new business, proving that there is a huge demand for our seafood. Every new restaurant in Paris or Dubai that serves Scottish seafood strengthens our industry back home. The industry contributes billions to our economy and supports thousands of jobs in fishing, processing and logistics. Strengthening this sector means ensuring stable livelihoods for coastal communities that have relied on the sea for generations. And Scottish seafood isn't just in demand in high-end restaurants abroad, it's also making its way into major retailers and emerging markets. And this diversification helps shield our industry from economic uncertainty and trade disruptions. Expanding our global reach helps to ensure long-term sustainability, but also means we must push for more support from the UK Government, working closely with producers to remove unnecessary barriers and provide the right support to maximise opportunities worldwide. Now, this international reputation is built on hard work and innovation, but to keep it growing, we need to make sure our seafood industry gets the support that it needs, and that means supporting exporters and making it easier to get Scottish seafood onto plates around the world. It means making sure our ports, markets, yes, I will.
Tim Eagle, briefly.
I'm just wondering, the industry were fairly upset a couple of weeks ago when they found out that one of John Swinney's special advisers had said that the spatial squeeze in the North Sea was not a thing. Do you agree with me that that's really unfair, given that the fishermen themselves across the North East are really concerned by the wind farms going on in the North Sea?
Again, a reminder through the Chair, Karen Adam.
Thank you. Well, Presiding Officer, I hadn't heard of that comment, but I'm happy to discuss that. But what I will say is that when I was first elected to this Parliament, I did note that there was a space that needed filling where fishers and the offshore wind industry could come together to have discussions on the blue economy, and that's why I set up the Fisheries and Coastal Communities Cross-Party Group, which I convene. Thank you. So crucially, it means investing in the next generation of fishers so our industry continues to thrive for years to come. And while our seafood is a huge success internationally, we should also be eating more of it ourselves. Fish is one of the healthiest, most sustainable and tastiest foods, I say, that we have access to. Yet many Scots don't eat the recommended amount, which is 2 portions a week, if anyone needs to know that. So part of a solution here is making sure that people can access and afford Scottish seafood. And it's a strange reality in a country surrounded by sea that we don't eat as much as we should. We need to make sure that we are holding retailers to account in this regard to properly support and promote our world-class produce, because supermarkets do play a huge role in this. They decide what's visible on our shelves, what's promoted and what's priced competitively. Now, right now, 37% of the supermarket promotions are for unhealthy, high-fat, high-sugar products, while fresh produce, including fish, is far less visible, and that has to change. When Lidl and Aldi invested in marketing Scottish seafood, they saw higher sales and increased market share, proving that when local produce is given prominence, people will buy it. So let's get all the major supermarkets on board, stock Scottish fish prominently, label it clearly, and run special offers on it, just as they do with the imported produce. And we must make sure our local food is properly supported by Scotland's biggest food retailers. Now, it's not just what's about in our shops, it's also about ensuring our young people are taught about this wonderful food source. And the Seafood in Schools programme has been brilliant in introducing young people to the benefits of Scottish seafood and showing them where their food comes from. If we want our seafood sector to continue thriving, we need to support it in any way possible, investing in our seafood infrastructure, upgrading ports, markets and processing facilities, and tackling workforce shortages, and that will keep our sector strong. We should encourage more Scots to eat Scottish seafood by launching public information campaigns, perhaps, and working with supermarkets to make our produce affordable and visible. Presiding Officer, by doing this, we can send a clear message that we believe in Scotland's seafood and we are committed to it, both at home and abroad. Scotland's seas are rich, but let's make sure we aren't just celebrating it, we are sustaining it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Adam. And I call Richard Leonard to be followed by Claire Haughey, up to 6 minutes. Mr Leonard.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I remind members of my voluntary register of trade union interests? And let me start with that, because before being elected to Parliament, I spent 2 decades representing workers in Scotland's food and drink industry. The brewers of Duke Street, the night shift at Carridon Bray, the coopers at Muir Hall, the cleaners at Carsbridge, the milk crumb processors in Girvan, and the bottling hall operatives on the Great Western Road. It was a privilege to represent them all. They formed an important part of my education, forged the bonds of lifelong friendships, and every single day gave me a lesson in precisely why we need an industrial strategy, a plan for the economy, and a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of power in the workplace and in the wider economy. We went through a lot together, sharing hope, facing setbacks, organising a movement, broadening the horizons of a class. They combined to fight for a living wage, took decisive action not just to defend their standard of living, but in pursuit of a better quality of life. They fought all too often with their backs against the wall for jobs and for security of employment. They championed the causes of justice and a fairer share out of the wealth the wealth that they were creating. And in so doing, we won victories over privilege and overcame inequalities. So I stood with them then, and I stand with them today in this Parliament, just as I also stand with those seasonal migrant workers, soon to be arriving in rural Scotland, in their battles for decent pay, decent accommodation and dignity at work. And I keep my faith that the day must come when trade unions will not just be a line of defence, but they will be an alternative line of advance, a means through which workers can participate in the running of the industry they work in, releasing their enterprise, their energy, releasing their initiative. I do not underestimate how far removed from that we are today, and not least in industries like food and drink, which more and more is run by absentee owners in faraway boardrooms and according to the portfolio interests of the global asset managers. And nowhere is this more evident than in the production of whisky, where, with a couple of notable exceptions, the Scotch whisky industry is no longer owned and controlled in Scotland, but in Paris, Bermuda, the Philippines, Japan, New York, Thailand, and in the boardrooms of Great Marlborough Street and the Stock Exchange. Ownership is power. It matters not least because 20% of all Scotland's international export earnings come from food and drink. It is ranked as our biggest export earner, and 80% of that comes from the export of whisky and other spirits. And so Parliament's message to the Government in today's debate must be that if we want the sector to thrive, we need to diversify as well as grow. We need to diversify because across the wider economy, we know that just 10 businesses account for almost a quarter of Scotland's international exports, just 20 for almost a third, and just 60 businesses in Scotland generate half of all our export earnings. Now, that makes us vulnerable at any time, but at a time when the White House is threatening tariffs and trade wars, it makes us ever more vulnerable now. So we need better support for producers to export, a workforce plan, more investment by the banks and our pension funds directly in industry, and more support for indigenous business growth. And when I hear of additional public investment being found for defence, like the £2 billion increase to UK export finance announced by the Chancellor on Friday for arms sales, at the same time that £5 billion is being cut from support for sick and disabled people, I do not rejoice, I despair. The industrial strategy that I want is both serious and it is grown up, but it does not depend on the Freeport, the weapons manufacturer, the arms trade and the nuclear menace, but rather on the development, the diversification and the democratisation of industries like food and drink. We should be increasing export finance, direct lending capacity to support them, to support their growth. Finally, last month the Cabinet Secretary told Parliament that since 2014 we have provided more than £7 million towards the Scotland Food and Drink Export Plan. But she must know that that represents just a drop in the ocean. Both of Scotland's governments, the enterprise agencies, the Scottish National Investment Bank, should be supporting this sector to grow. My job in Parliament, as it was before I came to Parliament, is not just to contest existing conditions, but to open up the possibility of an alternative. I will keep saying what I believe in. It is a socialist outlook based on experience, not simple ideology, and it is founded on that shared hope I spoke of, that a wider transformation of society is not just possible, it is socially, economically, environmentally and morally irrefutable.
Thank you, Mr London. I now call Claire Hockey to be followed by Craig Hoy. Up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In Chamber last week, I raised my concerns about the risks of the proposal for an English whisky geographical indication and asked how the Government are protecting the value of provenance in the Scottish food and drink industry. And I welcomed the Minister's reassurances that this Scottish Government is absolutely committed to supporting the sector and its incredible products. And it is, of course, one of the most successful sectors in Scotland, worth an incredible £15 billion, and is Scotland's biggest non-energy export. Scotland's produce is renowned for its quality and its clear provenance, and the sector is driven forward by the resilience and innovation of our producers and wholesalers. We often talk about the importance of the industry in relation to rural and island communities, and indeed many of my colleagues have mentioned this already in the debate. But of course it reaches into every community in Scotland, including more urban areas like my Rutherglen constituency. Dunn's Food and Drinks in Blantyre are a multi-award-winning wholesale supplier and one of Scotland's most historic family businesses, who are celebrating their 150th anniversary this year. In 1875, Joseph Dunn established a soft drinks business in the East End of Glasgow at a time when increasingly popular aerated waters were sold from horse-pulled carts. And Dunn's continued to expand through the 20th century, moving to Cambuslang in 1995 and then to Blantyre, where they remain today. Today, Dunn's Food and Drink is a fourth-generation company with Joseph Dunn's great-granddaughter, Julie Dunn, at the helm. And they have a remarkably wide portfolio of high-quality products which they deliver largely to the Scottish hospitality trade. Dunn's still retains their connection to the soft drinks industry via their Currys brand, home of many long-time family favourites. And I'm sure my Ayrshire colleagues will be as interested as I was to learn that their red cola recipe remains largely the same after 100 years. And that the product has a particularly committed following in and around Ayrshire, where it sells 2.5 million bottles a year. Also in my Rutherglen constituency, Spiceway in Rutherglen are another independent family-run food and drink wholesale business who have gone from strength to strength. Starting 22 years ago with a single vehicle and a 5,000 square foot warehouse, they now have facilities which spread over 40,000 square feet, a fleet of vehicles, and they supply retailers, manufacturers, hotels, restaurants, takeaways and events across the country. The Scottish wholesale sector provides a vital service in ensuring our food and drink supply chain runs smoothly and supporting retail and hospitality businesses. And the sector is undoubtedly crucial to the success of so many food and drinks businesses. Put simply, our producers make their world-class products, retailers and service providers make them available to the public, and wholesalers are the crucial conduit, who have an important role to play in the growth of Scotland's economy and the promotion of the Scottish food and drink industry. In recognition of this, I'm delighted that the Scottish Government has developed a strong collaborative partnership with the Scottish Wholesale Association and provides them with funding to help it to support our Scottish wholesalers and producers to increase the volume of local produce that's sold. And on that subject of the links between local produce and wholesale industry, PK Foods, also based in Rutherglen, supplies Indian starters and snacks to more than 90% of Scotland's wholesale sector and counts many major chains amongst their retail customers. They're another family business who have been in operation since 1997, and they pride themselves on keeping their entire operation in-house, from recipe development, cooking products from scratch, right through to packing and delivery. The company have estimated that they produce around 10 tonnes of pakora a week. So it's safe to say that if anyone in Chamber has eaten pakora recently, there's a very high chance that it was made in Rutherglen. Whatever part of the food and drink sector we're looking at, Presiding Officer, it's one which has shown much resilience in recent years in responding to the many challenges that it has faced. There remain clear areas of concern, from the economic strain caused by Brexit, inflationary pressures, increasing energy costs, and wide geopolitical disruptions and threats. To take Brexit as just one example, this is not a decision which Scotland voted for, but we've been left paying the price. UK households have paid £7 billion to cover the cost of post-Brexit trade barriers on food imports from the EU.
This has pushed up average household food costs by £250 since the end of 2019, and many Scottish suppliers are suffering due to the lower volume of exports to the EU and suffering from significant and immediate gaps in labour. The Scottish Government has taken every opportunity to engage with the UK Government to press it on the impact of Brexit and the UK immigration policies in Scotland's food and drink sectors, and we've heard some of that today. And we were told during the general election campaign that Labour was open to talks about mitigating labour shortages to help businesses reach their full potential, but nothing has happened. Instead, the new UK Labour Government has chosen to hammer Scottish businesses via their national insurance contributions, a tax on jobs. Entertained the idea of redefining single malt whisky to the detriment of the Scottish industry, and are making no argument to reverse Brexit, despite the fact that one of their ministers has stated that 60% of its impact is yet to materialise. Presiding Officer, the best future for the Scottish economy hinges on Scotland being an independent member within the EU, and in the meantime I'm confident the Scottish Government will continue to do all it can to support Scottish food and drink sector and its incredible products.
Thank you. And I'll call Craig Hoy to be followed by Emma Harper. Up to 6 minutes. Mr Hoy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Scotland's £15 billion food and drink sector is globally renowned and respected, but it is also neglected and sometimes it is scapegoated, including by its own government. The sector provides billions to the UK economy, and Scotch whisky alone contributes £7 billion, the vast majority of that sum generated here in Scotland. Our drinks industry is not only important to the Scottish economy in terms of income, jobs and exports, it is also a highly productive sector. It is entrepreneurial. It comprises large global multinational brands, but also smaller businesses, such as the Winton Brewery and Broughton Ales in the south of Scotland region that I represent. But it's also a key driver in other sectors, such as tourism, culture and advertising. And just look at the Edinburgh Gin Distillery, a new visitor attraction at the Arches, just a few yards away from the entrance to this Parliament. At the last count, Scotland had 100 breweries and over 4,300 pubs, employing 65,000 people and contributing £1.8 billion in wider economic benefits. Breweries and distilleries across Scotland employ locally, they are committed to sourcing locally wherever possible, and they work with hundreds of SMEs right across Scotland. But despite the powerful contribution the sector makes to the economy and to those who work within it, it still faces risks at home and abroad. The Scotch Whisky Association says that 2024 was a challenging year, with a 14% increase on tax of every bottle of Scotch whisky, the impact of inflation on input costs such as cereals, energy and shipping, the risk of the redesignation of Scotch in England, and of course now the threat of tariffs loom large. And here in Scotland, our drinks industry has been forced to grapple with a number of ill-thought-out SNP policies. The botched deposit return scheme, minimum unit pricing, the threat of restrictions on marketing and sponsorship, a threat withdrawn but is now back on the table again, and the impact of the SNP's failure to pass on rates relief to the Scottish hospitality sector. Now, Deputy Presiding Officer, we need a concerted effort to fend off these threats, including that the UK Government promotes strong and open trade relations with key export markets, including the US. And this also means John Swinney biting his tongue following a series of cat-handed interventions into UK-US security and trade discussions. But ministers must also choose their language very carefully on the Scottish alcohol industry more generally. Last year, the cross-party group on beer and pubs, which, for the record, I chair, recommended that the Scottish Government should rethink its, and I quote, seriously and curiously outdated and unbalanced attitude to the sector. And we called on ministers to recognise that there is a huge economic and social potential waiting to be unlocked in the sector, but only if the mood music is carefully chosen. And our report called on ministers to develop a coherent hospitality strategy aligned with the objectives of Brand Scotland. We need to give the sector a chance to thrive, and this Parliament and the Government need to deliver a period of regulatory calm and also deliver measures that incentivise investment. Because Brand Scotland aims to create Scotland as a place to be recognised as a highly desirable country to live, work, study, visit, trade and invest. But ministers need to be clearer about what role key industries such as Scotch whisky, craft gin and brewing play within this. Now, sadly, Scotland's pubs are closing at a faster rate than elsewhere in the UK, and investment is, Minister, being diverted because a lack of certainty makes it difficult to plan ahead. And we need urgent action on a number of other fronts, including the obstructive planning process and the employment challenges, including those created by Labour's national insurance increase, which are a barrier to growth. And I hate to say it, but the SNP, I think, must also address a creeping anti-alcohol agenda, which is being actively pursued by this SNP government. In fact, a senior executive from one of the largest global drinks producers told me that in all of the countries in which his firm operates, he had never seen a government which did so little to champion or defend its national drinks industry. And the lack of support for the sector is evident elsewhere. Scotland's pubs, as I said, are not receiving that lifeline business rate relief, which is an injustice and which will continue into next year. Presiding Officer, as our amendment makes clear, the industry has worked hard to address the harms of alcohol misuse through a range of local initiatives, such as Best Bar None, as well as supporting the work of Drinkaware and the Portman Group. But we also need action to support Scottish products and make more local beers available. And this is an opportunity that is created next month when the Scottish Pubs Code will enable Tide pubs to sell one guest beer from a small independent brewer. Now, as the sector looks forward, we also need to ensure that the operating environment is conducive to those who work in it. We all know that the beer and pub sector offers excellent employment opportunities, but we urgently need a more positive dialogue about the unique community value of the sector, the range of careers on offer and the transferability of the skills within the sector. Ministers also need to look to the employment situation in rural communities, where a lack of affordable housing and the shortage of public transport can cause specific problems. The 65,000 jobs provided by our breweries and pubs stretch from the borders to the Outer Isles and from city centres to Scotland's remote glens. This is the contribution of the sector across Scotland, and we should be rightly proud of it. Deputy Presiding Officer, Scotland's food and drink sector could and should have a bright future, but to deliver that, the Government must heed the warnings that have been made. We all recognise the economic and social contribution of the sector, but to ensure it continues, ministers must be willing to stand up and fully support it.
Thank you, Mr Hoy. I call Emma Harper to be followed by Colin Smith. Ms Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the motion from the Cabinet Secretary and the opportunity to highlight how the south of Scotland is in the Premier League when it comes to food and drink in Scotland and the world. The south of Scotland has some of the best produce in the world, being prepared by some of the best chefs and kitchen staff into some of the finest food and drink in the world. And I spoke about many of the wonderful producers and restaurants and everything in previous debates in this chamber. We do make whisky in the south of Scotland also. Bladnoch Distillery near Wigtown, Annandale at Annan, and the Borders Distillery at Hoyk, and now Crafty Distillery at Newton Stuart, and of course Moffat Distillery. They're all producing some of the very fine whiskies with an increasing positive global reputation. But that reputation was, and maybe still is, in danger of being harmed through the unfathomable actions of the UK Government recently with their proposals to create a geographical indication for English whisky and slip in the changes to the malt whisky definition through the back door. The Scotch Whisky Association have slammed this proposal. Thank goodness that it was spotted and called out for. Single malt means product from one distillery. Mashing and distillation, not just mash it anywhere and bring it in and distill it in one place. Presiding Officer, just last week we saw a slew of nominations for the South agribusinesses at the Countryside Alliance Awards, and Rachel Hamilton has mentioned some of them already, like Scots of Kelso. But I'm just going to add Five Kingdoms Brewery from the Isle of Whithorn, the Ship Inn at Dromore and the Selkirk Arms in Kirkcudbright, among others. They were all nominated for awards. And I couldn't miss the opportunity to plug the Stranraer Oyster Festival, which will take place this September. It was first held in 2017, and now it's attracting over 20,000 visitors every year. A huge boon to the local economy and a tribute to the hard work of Stranraer Development Trust and their partners in developing such a successful event. And I know the Cabinet Secretary is familiar with oysters and the Oyster Festival and has visited it on a number of occasions herself. So the Oyster Festival, it does show the kind of innovation in our food and drink sector across the South, with support from the Scottish Government and the South of Scotland Enterprise and other agencies. I also want to acknowledge the previous Cabinet Secretary, Richard Lockhead's work in his role in shaping the Government's direction towards high-end market of food and drink. During his tenure as Rural Affairs Secretary, he saw the huge potential in making sure that Scotland's world-leading food and drink sector was recognised globally for its quality, and the results of that, a decade on, are now being led by the Cabinet Secretary in front of me, and I'm really pleased to see that it's demonstrably clear that Scotland's food and drink is a global leader. But it's not just the high rolling end of the market where the South is doing well. I don't think I have time. I normally do take interventions, Presiding Officer, but I think the time is short because I've got a lot of notes that I made during everybody else's speeches. But just a couple of weeks ago, Arla Foods gave a massive vote of confidence to the Dumfriesshire economy with the news that up to 90 jobs will be created at their Lockerbie dairy processing facility and as it expands in the future. And Dumfries and Galloway is the core of Scotland's dairy industry, and as the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity told me the other week at Portfolio Questions, the Scottish Government is helping support Arla's continued success. The events in Ukraine over the past 3 years have shown the perils of relying so much on food imports. Before the war, 50% of world sunflower oil production was in Ukraine, 18% of barley and 12% of wheat grown came from the Ukraine. The Russian invasion has meant that prices for these basic foodstuffs has shot through the roof and supplies have been precarious at times. So food security is an absolute concern, so it's good to hear the Cabinet Secretary mentioning that. We need a strong and vibrant food and drink sector domestically, not just because it supports tens of thousands of rural jobs, but because it reduces our reliance on overseas imports that we have seen that can stop or slow down at the whim of a dictator like President Putin. We have a booming food and drink sector in Scotland, despite the weight of Brexit hanging around our necks of the whole industry. We should be clear in this Parliament that restored membership of the EU and the Customs Union, in line with the expressed will of the people of Scotland, is in short and long term in the best interest for our economy. And it is to the main Westminster Party's shame that they simply aren't interested in carrying out the will of the people in Scotland. Those on the benches opposite who campaigned to tear Scotland out of the EU should apologise to every farmer, every agriculture business, every food and drink producer in the land for the increased cost and the red tape that their disastrous kamikaze Brexit has imposed. And for the fact that as Trump rampages across international trade and tariffs, the UK is uniquely exposed to his irrational wrath, unlike the EU, who are able to work collectively to protect their food production agri-industries. It is a tribute to the tenacity, ingenuity and hard work of those businesses that they are still going and still maintaining their high quality, but we all know that Brexit has stopped them being able to go that extra mile and ramp things up to the next level. So I'm grateful we have a Scottish Government that has done its level best within the straitjacket of Westminster diktat to minimise the harms of Brexit that has caused, and stand up for a food and drink industry in Scotland and for the South. So thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Harper. I now call Colin Smith to be followed by Stuart McMillan. Mr Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, I appreciate that the Cabinet Secretary isn't going anywhere soon, but I was sorry to read about her decision to step down at the next election. I served as a local councillor for the same period as the Cabinet Secretary and we were elected to this Parliament at the same time. Mairi Gougeon has gone on to be a Cabinet Secretary and I have gone on to be the person that asked the Cabinet Secretary questions, but at least hopefully in a courteous and constructive manner. Now, I hope, however, that one of the Cabinet Secretary's legacies will be a Galloway National Park, a national park that's made in Galloway for the people of Galloway, one that protects and improves our outstanding natural environment, but crucially grows our local economy by supporting sectors such as our food and drink providers. I think that balance can be achieved, and I hope that is the conclusion Nature Scot and the Cabinet Secretary also comes to. Because, Presiding Officer, as we have heard in this debate already, our food and drink sector is a national success story. From our world-renowned whisky and seafood to our growing artisan food businesses, this sector is vital not just for our economy, but for our culture, for our communities, for our brand Scotland international reputation. It generates a turnover of £16 billion. It's responsible for £7 billion in exports, over 30% of the UK's total. It employs over 129,000 people. And crucially, with 97% of those businesses being SMEs, many of those jobs are created in economically fragile rural communities. It's a sector that reaches and benefits parts of Scotland that others cannot and don't reach. Now, I see that week in, week out in my own South Scotland region, visiting local producers and processors, agricultural shows, country fairs, local farms, markets, fishing ports, hotels, and a distillery or brewery or two, or maybe 3 or 4. It's a genuine delight to be able to eat and drink my way across my region on a regular basis, maybe a bit too regularly, but I want to thank the food and drink sector across Scotland, our farmers, our fishers, our shop workers, processors, wholesalers, deliverers, who have delivered that success story. But I do know from that journey, I don't think I've got any additional time, I don't think, is that right?
No additional time. It's up to the member whether he wishes to
I would like to do so, but unfortunately I want to highlight a few particular issues, because I know from that journey across my region, engaging with businesses, that there are no shortages of issues being raised, and many of those issues sit with this Parliament and with the Scottish Government. A week really passes when I don't speak to a business struggling to recruit skilled workers. One major hotel I visited in the Scottish borders told me they weren't running at capacity, not because of a lack of demand, but because of a lack of skilled staff. And these were well-paid, highly skilled posts that remained unfilled. So no wonder Borders College and others have criticised the decision to axe the flexible workforce development fund and other support to get more skilled workers into the workplace. Our producers, our farmers, our manufacturers need that steady pipeline of newly qualified skilled workers. The Food and Drink Federation estimates that the sector needs nearly 35,000 new recruits by 2031 to fill skills gaps. Government agencies need to work. I don't think I've got enough time to do that to get through everything I need to make that point. But government agencies do need to work more closely with schools, with colleges, with universities to develop the right training programmes that align with industry's needs, with more investment in apprenticeships and a renewed focus on our food and drink careers. And, Presiding Officer, unless we address the chronic housing shortage, especially in rural areas, I'll continue to meet businesses such as those I met in Dumfries and Galloway, who told me that even when they find staff who want to take up posts, the appointments often fall through because there's no affordable housing nearby. But I've also met businesses that are global leaders in sustainable food and drink production, focusing, for example, on carbon capture, particularly in the whisky industry. We need to support those industries in the transition to net zero by offering targeted financial incentives for adopting greener technologies, improving energy efficiency and reducing food waste. Our farming and fishing industries also need a longer-term strategy, one that balances economic growth with our environmental responsibilities. Without proper stewardship, our marine biodiversity and coastal economies will suffer. It's time to set out a robust plan for sustainable fisheries that protects both our waters and the livelihoods of those that depend on it. The Good Food Nation plan should be at the heart of this, ensuring sustainability and food security for future generations. But unfortunately, the current draft plan does lack the ambition needed to achieve that. That plan should set out how, for example, we embed farming, fishing and food production at every level of education and place a stronger emphasis on procuring and promoting local food and drink. The Scottish Government, local authorities and public bodies spend £16 billion annually on goods and services, including food. Yet for too long, public procurement has prioritised cost over sustainability. We should consider, for example, clear targets for increasing the percentage of locally sourced, sustainable, nutritional food bought by the public sector. Supporting local supply chains not only boosts businesses, but reduces their carbon footprint and helps tackle food insecurity. Food and drink are not just economic assets, they impact on public health, the environment and standards of animal welfare. But for too long, too many people in Scotland have lacked access to nutritional food, exposing deep inequalities. That's why the decision not to embed the right to food in the Good Food Nations Bill was deeply disappointing, a missed opportunity. The SNP and Greens assured us it would be addressed in a forthcoming human rights bill, but whatever happened to that? Presiding Officer, our food and drink sector has the potential to grow further, to create more jobs, to boost our economy, to strengthen Scotland's global standing, but this will not happen without the right support.
Thank you, Mr Smith. I now call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Douglas Ross. Mr McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, I'd like to wish the Cabinet Secretary well for the remainder of her time here in the Parliament and also beyond. I think it's been an interesting debate so far, and it's very obvious to me that it's only with independence can we actually do a lot more with regards to Scotland's food and drink. I mean, we know certainly from the Tory whisky duty hikes when they were last in power that actually reduced tax revenue by £300 million to Labour's national insurance hikes threatening jobs. So it's clear that we actually can do so much more if we actually were an independent country. Yep. Now, also, I agree actually with Claire Hawkey's comments earlier on. Sorry, Mr Hoy. I normally do take interventions, but not today. I do agree with Claire Hawkey's comments that she's leaving the chamber as I'm going to praise her. And that's because Claire Hawkey spoke about, it's not just about rural communities and island communities. Urban communities too have got a huge amount to offer when it comes to food and drink in Scotland. So this particular debate, I actually wanted to speak on it because it reminded me of a debate that took place in 2018 in which I spoke in. And I spoke about how important the food and drink industry is to Scotland, but also to my Greenock and Inverclyde constituency. And at that time, I gave special mention to a company called the New Chocolate Company, based in Port Glasgow. In fact, it delivered some chocolate. I actually delivered some chocolate to MSP's offices afterwards. Sadly, I can't do the same today. It's the only negative point I'm going to talk about today. Sadly, the couple who ran the business retired, and the place is now no longer operational. But I genuinely wish them very well in their retirement because they provided an absolutely outstanding product. But Port Glasgow has now got a company called Downriver Coffee Roasters. It's set up by Ryan, who originally was from New York, but she came to Scotland in 2015 to study. Now, Ryan and her wife moved to Inverclyde during the pandemic, and soon after she began pursuing a career in coffee roasting. And despite being a young business, Ryan has put a mark on the local economy, and she's supplying local hospitality businesses as well as having customers outside of the constituency. Now, Ryan's business acumen and commitment to sustainably sourced coffee saw Downriver win the Entrepreneurialism Award last year and nominated for the Sustainability category at the Inverclyde Chamber of Commerce Icon Awards. In 2018, Presiding Officer touched upon the multi-award-winning McCaskey's Butchers based in Wemyss. Now, McCaskey's is now in the third generation of family ownership under Nigel Ovens, and it's in fact considered Scotland's most awarded butcher. Now, this is testament to their outstanding products. I also mentioned the Golden Casket Group, considered to be one of the largest and most innovative confectionery specialists within the UK, who are based in Greenock. From Buchanan's toffees and chocolates, Millions, All-Rounders, Hoyt Balls, Gibb products and many others, they produce delicious products which are sold far and wide. Now, the business is once again family-owned, and it's now in its third generation, and they are extremely important for the local economy. It's not just the businesses themselves that contribute to Inverclyde's growing food and drink sector, however. Kempock Street in Gougeon, for example, has seen a growth in footfall, which was given a huge boost to hospitality, and certainly the bi-monthly Gougeon Farmers Market is also something that's very much worthwhile visiting. In Greenock, West Park Call Street has recently undergone investment to try to recreate some of the success that's taken place in Gougeon. Having only reopened earlier this year, there remains some scepticism as to whether it will deliver more footfall. However, it has attracted new businesses in recent years. We've got Bird Chicken Shop, which also does halal, vegan and gluten-free offerings. We've got The Alchemist, which is a new coffee shop which offers sandwiches and bakers from other local stores, helping the local economy, including Tonino's focaccia breads, which really are out of this world. And Tonino's also is a multi-award-winning facility within the constituency. We've also got a particular business set up, 17 in Gong, set up by Ben Egan, who travelled to Japan to train. And he chose, it didn't come from Inverclyde, he chose to come to Inverclyde to set up his business. And all of his produce is manufactured in the restaurant, and it's all done from raw materials. So he makes everything himself. That brings very little in. Now, so Ben, he has travelled the world to bring in certainly some of the best flavours and combinations, and his menu changes every few weeks, but it's normally focused upon specific cuisines such as Japanese, Taiwanese and Vietnamese cooking. Greenock also has the 120-year-old family baker, Ald's, multi-award-winning again, delicious products certainly for the community and also beyond. But this family baker is vital to our local economy, creates many hundreds of jobs. Now, I'm going to touch upon two aspects with regards to drink. Now, the award-winning Titan rum. 3 guys had a hobby, and they liked rum, but they had a hobby, and so decided to make rum. So it's based in Greenock, and it's also stocked in the Scottish Parliament bar, if anyone is of interest. But multi-award-winning as well. And in June of this year, I touched upon this in the last time I spoke, but in June of this year, 20th of June, our Gougeon distillery in Inverkip is going to open. In 2018, I stated Inverkip will join the whisky trail soon when their Gougeon distillery is built. So that was 7 years ago, and it will be a real pleasure to see that whisky distillery open. I've engaged a great deal over the years, particularly the CEO, Martin McAdam, and also the major shareholder, Roland Grain. And I can't wait for that to open, because it certainly will put Inverkip and also Inverclyde on the whisky map, and it can only be a good thing for the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms McMillan. I call Douglas Ross to be followed by Ben McPherson. Mr Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It's a pleasure to contribute in today's debate, and I think it's been interesting to hear from across the constituencies and regions many of the local suppliers that members use and support. And it also got me thinking that a lot of these suppliers start off very small and they build up a nucleus, and they have to get known. And part of the process for becoming known in your local community is getting publicity, and some of that is done through our local press. And in the gallery today, the former editor of the Northern Scot, Chris Saunderson, is with us. And I think it's important that we also recognise how our local papers can sometimes be the ones that really promote these businesses to a wider audience, and then they can go on and grow even further. And that's something I wanted to get on the record. But I'm going to focus a lot of my remarks today on the GI status of Scotch single malt whisky and the application for an English single malt. And we're being asked today, we're being invited by the Labour Party to congratulate them, to applaud this shameful UK Labour government for something they haven't actually done. Well, Rhoda Grant is already shaking her head. She wouldn't give way to me at all, but I will give way to Rhoda Grant if she can answer this point. Because in their amendment, and in Daniel Johnson's intervention to the Cabinet Secretary earlier, they were telling us, relax, everything is fine. Indeed, Daniel Johnson told us because a Labour minister had said something, it will be true. Well, I'm not sure I believe that, because it was Labour politicians that told us they wouldn't change the inheritance tax for farmers. How did that go? But the point I've got for Rhoda Grant, as she gets ready to intervene, is this. And I was going to make this point to her, but she refused to take my intervention a number of times. On one hand, the Labour Party here in Holyrood are telling us, don't worry, the situation has been resolved. On the other hand, I received a letter from the Minister of State from the UK Labour government, Daniel Zeichner, just last week about this. And this is what he said about the English malt whiskies application for a GI status to be single malt. He says, and I quote, DEFRA is satisfied that it meets the requirement of the relevant legislation. He goes on to say, it is important to note that the proposed single malt definition in the English Whisky Guild's GI application aligns with all relevant UK legislation. So how does the comment in black and white from a UK government minister representing the Labour Party align with what the Scottish... I'm going to give way to Rhoda Grant, because Rhoda Grant was seeking to intervene. How does that align with what Scottish Labour are telling us in their amendment today, that everything is fine and there's nothing to worry about? I'll give way to Rhoda Grant. I'll give way to Rhoda Grant, who wants to intervene.
Rhoda Grant.
I didn't ask to intervene, but at the same time, I would have to say that the member may stand up in this Parliament and say things that maybe aren't true, but what was said in the UK Parliament, I would have to say is true, and he has to accept that.
Douglas Ross.
This is quite a revelation. Rhoda Grant says that Daniel Zeichner MP Minister of State for the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, I'll hold up the letter because it's got the letterhead from the UK Government Department, has said something that is apparently not true. I'm only reading out what UK Labour politicians are telling us. If that's not true, Rhoda Grant should go back to her own government and tell them not to write letters of clarification, because apparently they're wrong. But if Rhoda Grant wants to give way, intervene again, I'll give way.
Rhoda Grant.
The letter talks about legal competence. What the Minister said on his hind legs in the Parliament was they were not going to change a definition.
Exactly.
Douglas Ross.
The letter makes it very clear, and I'll read it again. DEFRA is satisfied that the application meets the requirements of the relevant legislation. It is important to note that the proposed single malt definition in the English Whisky Guild's GI application aligns with all relevant UK legislation. I'm sorry, Scottish Labour cannot come to this chamber today, want to be congratulated for solving the problem when the problem still exists, and it is incumbent on members of this Parliament to stand up for the Scotch whisky industry. And in fact, the industry themselves have come up with a pragmatic solution, and I also want to get that on the record. They are very clear that if English malt whisky becomes the definition, that can be whisky produced at multiple destinations and different areas. The single malt definition is one so important to Scotch whisky. All of us in this chamber should be doing our utmost to protect it, rather than Labour MSPs coming here simply trying to protect their government. In my final few seconds, Presiding Officer, I also want to say that we are right to celebrate our produce here in the chamber today. But there will be no produce. There will be no Scots produce from our farmers if there are no farms left. And I think it's important, again, to reiterate the campaign that with no farmers there is no food. I agreed with what the Cabinet Secretary was saying about food security. I now think food security is as important as energy security here in Scotland and across the UK. And while the debates have not been as numerous in recent weeks and months, the protests continue at Westminster against the UK Labour Government and their plans for inheritance tax. And it is right that we continue to raise those points in this chamber and remind the Labour Party what they are threatening to do to the industry here in Scotland and across the country will not only impact our farming communities now, but also into the future. And I hope even at this late stage they will reconsider and remove their plans on the inheritance tax that are going to have such an impact on Scottish and UK farming.
Thank you, Mr Ross. And I call Ben McPherson. Mr McPherson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I also wish to start today by paying tribute to my colleague Mairi Gougeon, and very sorry to hear that she will not be seeking to come back to Parliament. I think the only time since she became a Minister in 2018 where she didn't work in this portfolio was when I subbed in for 6 months as Minister for Rural Affairs and the Natural Environment, working with Fergus Ewing and Rosanna Cunningham. And I think Mairi Gougeon is a superb example of somebody who works diligently and effectively getting things done through turbulent times. And when fulfilling that role for 6 months as Minister for Natural Environment and Rural Affairs, I was reminded, as the MSP who represents the most densely urban part of Scotland, how important the natural environment and rural affairs are to all of us, including those of us who live in the cities. Leith is the most densely populated part of our country, the Leith Walk ward. And also Leith, as a wider area, is of course somewhere that has been important and is important today in the story of Scotland's food and drink success. As one of the major ports, both in centuries past and in the current times, Leith has been a place where manufacturers have made and exported their products, and also, including today, a place where people have come to visit and live and enjoyed some of the best of what Scotland has to offer. Today, for example, there are the 3 Michelin-starred restaurants, there are so many cafes, so many other restaurants, so many pubs and bars, too many to list. But as colleagues know and visitors know, and the population of Scotland know, Leith is a great destination. Historically, it was where Rosie's lime cordial was invented, one of the most significant and well-known soft drinks and products used in both baking and also, of course, in bartending. As a previous bartender, I know that well. Krabby's whisky was made in Leith in years past and continues to be made in Bonington. And today we also have the award-winning Woven whisky and the newly iconic, in terms of its status on the skyline on the Forth, the Port of Leith distillery, the world's first vertical and highest vertical distillery. As well as making whisky, which I'll say more about in a moment, there are 5 breweries in my constituency. There's Coldtown, Pilot, Newbarns, Campervan and Moonwake, and also Edinburgh Shortbread. Members know that there are many famous shortbread brands, including in the area that the last member who spoke in the debate knows very well. But Edinburgh shortbread has grown in recent years as well, not just as something enjoyed here, but across the world and on airlines. There is Pokey Tea in my constituency, which is a growing exporter of a variety of teas made in Leith. And of course, there are many bakeries, whether it's the famous institution on Leith Walk of Stories, the newly, in recent years, surging Babyface Baker, Mimi's Bakehouse, which of course has expanded to elsewhere in the city, Mario Patisserie, the Sicilian Bakery, Hobbs Bakery in Leith Walk, and Crema as well, all of which are good for celebrating special occasions. The reason I list all of this is because, whether it's in Leith in my constituency or elsewhere in the country, through turbulent times of COVID, Ukraine and the current concerns over the actions of the Trump administration, whether it's through the folly of Brexit, the current NI increases, which are affecting many of businesses in my constituency, and we were about to see the worrying effects of that. And I think that will be one of the biggest mistakes that this Labour government makes, and it's made several already. The tax on the whisky industry that's been applied. I remember Labour MPs before the election in July talking so passionately about how they supported Scots whisky, and then one of the first things they've done in their first budget is increase the duty. I mean, you almost can't make it up in these scenarios. In terms of devolved issues, the Cabinet Secretary should be aware that I have written to Finance Ministers about some concerns about LBTT and pubs in my constituency, which I think would be worth looking at. And there are, I think, some sensitive issues. Other members have talked about this in terms of the challenge we face about reducing problematic alcohol consumption in our country with supporting our food and drinks industry. And when alcohol advertising is considered again, I would encourage a collaborative approach by all, because the producers that I talked about in my constituency, along with others, want to be positive contributors to our society and our economy. And it's important that smaller businesses can break into markets and people can discover their products, and a lot of that is about advertising both in the shop and in other ways. So there are collaborative solutions that can be found. Lastly, I would just like to say, it's not been mentioned yet, but one of the important underlying factors of why our food and drinks industry is so successful, one of many, of course, it's people with creativity is most important, and produce, but also water. The fact that Scottish water is a mutual, that it's cheaper here, and that it's of such high quality is something we shouldn't underestimate.
Thank you, Mr McPherson. We now move to closing speeches. I call on Ariane Burgess to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Presiding officer, during the debate we've heard a lot about exports, and while they have an important role to play, we must not lose sight of the fact that we need to produce food and drink for the people of Scotland, and do so in a regenerative and sustainable way. And it's simply not good enough that communities in my region don't have guaranteed access to good nutrition, as the Scottish Human Rights Commission's Highlands and Islands report told us. Nor is it right that children in the most deprived areas across the country are struggling with food insecurity and malnutrition. something that was highlighted in Food Standards Scotland's recent dish report. Let's export, but let's also ensure that we're making food and drink accessible to all. Reflecting on today's debate, I agree with Christine Graham and Claire Haughey that Brexit is one of the biggest threats to Scottish food and drink sector. It's been an economic disaster for farmers and supply chains, and if Scotland had had its wish and had remained in the EU, we wouldn't be standing here today to talk about how the UK government isn't respecting the provenance of Scotch whisky, something that clearly Scottish Labour appears to be unclear on today. I also share the concerns made by several of my colleagues that fisheries are being excluded from the National Marine Plan too, and I would urge the government to rethink this so that we can designate parts of the sea to be fished and which can be left, and other parts that can be left to nature. Richard Leonard made valuable points about seasonal migrant workers. We need to ensure that they aren't exploited and that they're properly housed and that they have a voice. In my opening speech, I spoke about the threats faced by Scotland's food and drink sector, and there are solutions, and it is these that I now wish to set out. I highlighted the need for multi-year funding for food and drink production, and while the UK government's decision to remove the ring fencing around Scotland's farming budget was welcome, we still have no idea about what that funding will look like from next year, and it makes it incredibly difficult for our government to do its job properly, which in turn impacts our food and drink producers who cannot plan with any certainty, nor confidently transition towards regenerative, sustainable farming practices that will safeguard their future against the climate and nature crises. Multi-year funding and the allocation of an adequate proportion of this money to the food and drink budget would let Scotland achieve these farming goals and also allow us to deliver on the aims of the expected Good Food Nation plan, which will create a healthy, resilient Scotland, protect our unique cultural identity, open up high-quality local food for everyone, and do so in a just way. Of course, these solutions don't happen without people, which is why I've been working with key farming organisations on the proposal that the government funds the creation of a food production skills pipeline. If we're to shift from a system that prioritises extraction at the expense of everything else to one that requires our producers to look after everything from soil health to biodiversity, as well as feeding people, we will need to upskill all existing food and drink workers and create a pathway that encourages young people to consider a career in the food sector. Apologies, the time doesn't seem to be working, so
Ms Burgess, indeed, and apologies for that, but I did note when you started,
Thank you.
If you take 6 minutes, add that on to that point, it takes you to 16:34 and 16 seconds.
Okay, thank you very much. Very precise. As it stands, 1/3 of the current workforce will hit retirement age over the next decade. Scotland needs to be in a position to replace these workers. And to do so, we need to offer young people and new entrants the opportunity to get into the food and drink sector, from school all the way through university and beyond, and show them that it's an exciting sector to work in. After all, future food workers are going to be at the cutting edge of tackling the climate and nature emergencies while feeding people. And they will need to have the ability to deploy many different... I'm going to keep going because I'm just not sure on the time and I've got quite a lot to say, but apologies on that. They will need to have the ability to deploy many different skill sets, including engineering, marketing and technology. And I'm pleased that the Scottish Government has recognised this proposal from key farming organisations and look forward to continuing discussions with the Government on this. The common thread running through all of these solutions is diversity. In the face of the threat of food security posed by climate change, we need to diversify what we eat. At present, 10% of Scotland's agricultural land is used for crops. 80% of the grain we produce is used for animal feed or whisky. What we need is more fruit, vegetables, cereals and pulses for human consumption. I support the food charity Nourish's vision for glass houses like those in the Netherlands that allow fruit and vegetables to be grown pretty much anywhere and allow rural and island communities to benefit economically and access locally grown nutritious food. If we're going to continue supporting the whisky industry, we must also see them get what they need from genuine, regenerative, sustainable sources. And there are great examples of distilleries doing this, such as McMillan in Morven. To conclude, doing all of this would ensure a resilient, healthy system that meets our food needs. We also require a diverse workforce made up of new entrants and experienced workers. And not only so that the food and drink sector is exposed to different ways of thinking, but also so that our rural communities can continue to thrive. Doing so will ensure Scotland's food and drink can survive the hurdles that will be presented over the next decades, while at the same time protecting our population and preserving our culture.
Thank you, Ms Burgess. I now call on Daniel Johnson to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I begin too, although she's left the chamber, join the chorus of praise for the Cabinet Secretary. And at the risk of making a dreadful pun, I'm quite convinced that she's off to pastures new rather than being sent out to pasture. And that's not the last pun that I'll be making in a debate on food and drink. Indeed, you'd have thought this afternoon that a debate of food and drink, that there would be a point of consensus, something that we could all agree on. But you can only trust the Scottish Parliament to turn a debate on food and drink into something of a bun fight. But look, I think what we have heard is a long list of products from a lot of different people: whisky, salmon, seafood, Scotch and beef and lamb, shortbread, cheese and dairy products. The list goes on. Scotland has a breadth of food and drink products, ones which are absolutely world-leading, and absolutely, I think the one point of consensus we did hear from throughout the chamber is the need to actually focus on how we can grow that, how we can promote, how we can become a genuinely world-leading food nation. But I do think that list is instructive in a number of other ways, in terms of the importance of some of those products and the nature of our food exports. But let me deal with them in order. So on the whisky point, and I don't think Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, could have been clearer on the 4th of March. He said, and I'm quoting now, "Scotch whisky is a proud brand and export, and this government will always support the industry. I have checked with ministers from the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and I can confirm that we will not be," if I can just finish the quote, not be watering down the definition of single malt whisky. So I understand the concerns, but that, I think, is as clear as possible. And I recognise the letter Douglas Ross' point, but my reading of that, or as I was listening very carefully to that is a point around legal competence. It is not an acceptance of the definition. But I do think Claire Hawkey was first with her attempted intervention.
Claire Hawkey.
I thank Daniel Johnson for taking my intervention, and I hear what he's saying about what was said on the floor of the House of Commons. However, we've heard a lot from Labour politicians in recent months. In the lead up to the election, we heard about how they were going to cut fuel payments and energy bills. They've gone up 3 times. Does he understand why the Scottish people don't trust what Labour says anymore?
Daniel Johnson.
All I can point to is the clarity that we have from the government, but more than that, as I was indicating in my previous interventions, is the priority that the UK Labour government has placed on whisky in terms of pursuing those trade talks with India. The Indian market, let's remember, is the biggest market for Scotch whisky by volume, and a market where the Scotch currently faces 150% tariffs, which is why the UK government brought forward the talks in January and why those are so important. But also to confirm, the Scotch Whisky Association themselves, and again I'm quoting, said that the statement made by Darren Jones was a welcome statement. So, by all means, let's push for the clarifications, but I don't think it could have been clearer. Happy to confirm.
Douglas Ross.
I'm grateful to Daniel Johnson for giving way, but he's speaking about clarity. When one UK Government Minister says something on the 4th of March, and another UK Government Minister writes to MSPs on the 13th of March with 2 quite distinctly different comments, does he really think we've got any clarity at all?
Daniel Johnson.
But I think it was a different point that was addressing, about legal competence versus what was being accepted. But let me move on, because I think the second point, and I think we have to have, and I know that the Parliament is having a debate about salmon, because I think there were important points raised by both Ariana Burgess and Beatrice Wishart. Of course, there are issues in terms of environmental impact with aquaculture. Indeed, there's issues around the environmental impact of all food production. By definition, when we are producing food from the land and the sea, we have to think about the environment. But salmon is a hugely important product. It is a hugely important export for this country. And what we need to be doing is working together, looking very clear-eyed at the issues faced by the industry, but how we can improve, how we can have absolutely the best highest standards in salmon production in the world, because I think other markets, that is exactly what they're doing. The Norwegians aren't holding back their aquaculture and salmon industries. They are pursuing the high quality and seeking to expand. And I think we should be supporting the salmon industry as we pursue those best standards, because we need those jobs. We need those exports. And we should be supporting those jobs and exports from parts of the country that, quite frankly, would be struggling for industry if it wasn't for aquaculture. But the other point about this list is if you take those two, that's £5 billion worth of exports from whisky, £1 billion from salmon. That's £6 billion of the 8. We are hugely reliant, perhaps, dare I say, over-reliant on those 2 points. And I think we need to be challenging ourselves, is how can we go further? How can we diversify our food exports? Because while there are other important products, they are measured in terms of their export value in hundreds of millions of pounds, not billions. So where is the strategy to deliver? And I think that is the challenge that I'm happy to.
Briefly, Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the members taking intervention. I mean, he talks about the importance of exports and particularly food exports. Does he think Labour's family farm tax will be positive or detrimental to improving our exports and our farming communities?
Daniel Johnson.
Look, quite simply, there were tax loopholes enjoyed by the likes of Jeremy Clarkson that had to be closed. And I think people need to be fair. Now, I recognise the impact and the transition, but there are transition arrangements being put in place. There will be a period of time for people to pay that tax. But people, when they inherit property, should pay tax. That's my simple point. But look, the key point is this, is in comparison, if we look internationally, while Scotland has £8 billion of food exports, Ireland has €18 billion worth. That is getting on for double. Now, that should be the scale. How do we achieve that? And I think Rhoda Grant made some important points about what are the issues that we need to tackle. How can we grow? So we know in other parts of enterprise policy, we have the Tech Scaler Network. We have a programme about how businesses and industries can grow. So where is the Scaler Network for food? Because we know, because of the requirements for equipment and capital, that growing a food business is much harder than a technology business. And likewise, what are our agencies doing? How are they working together to support that growth? Enabling businesses to invest in that equipment, but also dealing with complex supply chains and quite often the very challenging nature of selling into the supermarkets. Because after all, it's scale we need if we want to deliver jobs and realise the benefit for the whole population for Scotland's food and drink exports. And I did want to just briefly acknowledge the science point around precision breeding and gene editing is one that I'm welcome has been brought to the Chamber, because it's an important issue that we need to be having a very clear-eyed look at. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. I now call on Jamie Halker-Johnson to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I draw members' attention to my register of interest as a partner in a farming business? Presiding Officer, it's always important that time is given to debating Scotland's food and drink sector, but rarely is it as important as it is now. Because, as my Scottish Conservative colleagues and others across this chamber have rightly highlighted, there are real pressures on this sector. Our food and drink sector contributes millions to Scotland's economy. It supports tens of thousands of jobs right across the country, many of which are in the rural and island communities of my Highlands and Islands region. And it's a vital sector for my region, often the backbone of local communities, but one that is being let down by both of Scotland's governments. I'll start with one of the most pressing issues, one mentioned repeatedly. I've just highlighted Labour's damaging family farm tax. I had hoped that Rhoda Grant and her Labour colleagues might come to this debate perhaps with a little bit more humility than in previous debates, that perhaps they might even recognise and accept the damage their government's actions will have on the rural communities they're supposed to represent. But they didn't. In fact, they hardly mentioned it at all. And I think Daniel Johnson's comments only recently will highlight to Scotland's rural communities how little they mean to this Labour Party. Because let's be clear, every pound of additional tax Labour takes from our farmers is money taken right out of rural communities. It's a barrier to investment. It is a tax on rural and island Scotland that needs more investment, not less. It is a betrayal of those communities. And every Labour MP and every Labour MSP who backs their family farm tax should be ashamed of themselves and ashamed of their failure to stand up for the communities they're supposed to represent. And that is why I was pleased to join my colleague Tim Eagle in meeting with Shadow Secretary of State for Rural Affairs, Victoria Atkins, last week, and to hear her say unequivocally, no ifs, no buts, that the next UK Conservative government will end Labour's family farm tax. But SNP members shouldn't get too comfortable, and they might want to remember that the farmers' rally held outside this building only last year wasn't aimed at the Labour government at all, although there was rightly a considerable focus on that disastrous administration. It was focused on Scottish ministers and what they needed to do to support the industry. And the concerns that those farmers raised at that rally were entirely justified, because we now know that rather than investing in our rural communities, rural affairs was the only part of the budget that faced a cut, down 3.1% in real terms in 2025-26. We're seeing cattle numbers drop, and we have a government that wants to, overall, reduce red meat consumption. A government working against the very interests of a vital sector, a world-leading sector. That really makes no sense. Now, pressures on the supply of red meat mean that cattle and sheep prices are currently good for those left standing, but how long will that last for? And although we and our farm are organic, I know the pressures for rising fertiliser costs are causing farmers, as well as increasing fuel prices, the cost of Labour's national insurance contributions and other rising costs. Many farmers feel government, whether in Edinburgh or in London, are disconnected from what's happening in rural communities and the impacts of their policies. And so it's little wonder that confidence in government is so low, and that anger is growing across the sector. Farmers are frustrated, and I've heard more militant language from farming colleagues than ever before. UK and Scottish Government ministers must listen, but there has also been some frustration with farming leaders themselves, and I hope they're listening to the grassroots of our sector too. But it's not just rural affairs ministers that have been letting our communities down. Right across the Scottish Government, ministers have time and time again been found wanting. Others have mentioned the importance of vital infrastructure and the SNP's mismanagement of our ferries network, a network that lurches from one crisis to another, severely impacts our food and drink sector, particularly those trying to get fresh produce, such as fresh fish, to market. Our amendment also highlights the importance of our tourism and hospitality sectors. These sectors have been repeatedly hammered by the SNP, already subject to additional cost and regulatory burdens from short-term lets licensing, and with the ill-thought-out visitor levy now hanging over their heads. The hospitality sector was forced to prepare for a deposit return scheme the Scottish Government were unable to deliver, but not before having to spend tens of millions of pounds preparing for it, money that is now not able to be used for future investment in their businesses. If I can turn to some of the contributions from others, Tim Eagle rightly highlighted the impact of the SNP's decision not to pass on business rate relief support to hospitality, and how its lack of business rate support has stifled growth and investment. He also mentioned the cuts to college places, something that's been raised with me by a number of businesses who need skilled workers, particularly younger workers, if they are to grow, and these cuts work against that aim. And recognising that, and to feed a glowing population, the world isn't going to need less food, it will need more. The opportunities for Scotland are clear. Tim Eagle was quite right to highlight and recognise the importance of gene editing and the role it can play in improving disease resistance, drought tolerance and help produce higher yields. Rachel Hamilton and my Highlands and Islands colleague Beatrice Wishart mentioned the pressure on our vital fishing sector and the challenges from increased spatial squeeze. The sector faces challenges from new offshore wind farms, and as well as the uncertainty from cloth-eared policy proposals like the SNP's thankfully now dumped HPMAs. Douglas Ross, and I would urge people to go back and listen to his contribution, as it highlighted the utter confusion in Scottish Labour ranks over English whisky. I would say a confusion that was not in any way improved or cleared up by either Rhoda Grant's or Daniel Johnson's contributions. Craig Hoyd called for a period of regulatory calm, and that measures should be put in place to incentivise investment. I can only imagine how well that would be well received by so many of Scotland's producers. And as a stalwart supporter of Scotland's beer and pub sector, Mr Hoy's warnings that Scotland's pubs are closing at a faster rate than elsewhere in the UK should worry us all. They're often the shop front for many Scottish drinks products, and they need to support and not what Mr Hoy describes as a creeping anti-alcohol agenda from this SNP government. I also will just comment very briefly, or just highlight the contribution of Christine Graham, who I think must be on commission for a number of local businesses. I would point out that SNP members, it wasn't just Christine Graham. Well, I haven't made my point yet.
The members will be bringing his remarks to a close shortly.
If you want to clarify that you're not on commission, that's fine.
Christine Graham, thank you.
Well, I think a very valuable contribution for Christine Graham. I think it brings us a more serious point, though, that a number of MSPs spoke about Brexit, but they, of course, refused to recognise the fact that the UK market is our most important market. And, of course, that if the SNP were to get its way, Scottish fishermen, so vital and mentioned again and again, would actually be back in the CFP and under the control of Brussels. And I don't think that is something the fishing industry wants. Richard Leonard had another impassioned speech, mainly an attack on his own government, which was always very enjoyable. But again, it was interesting how few, in fact, I don't think any of the Labour members actually mentioned the family farm tax. Presiding officer, before I conclude, it would be remiss of me not to mention some of the fantastic drinks producers in my region. Of course, Speyside is the home of single malt, but decent drams can be found across the Highlands and Islands, including Highland Park and Scapper and Ortley in the Isle of Raasay, and, of course, new distilleries such as Ardnamurchan. Presiding officer, in conclusion, I am proud to be, in some small way, part of Scotland's food and drink production line. Scotland is blessed with a land and sea that makes us the home of some of the world's best produce, but we mustn't be complacent. It must be nurtured and supported, and that needs both UK and Scottish governments to not only listen to industry concerns, but to act on them as well.
Thank you, Mr Halker-Johnson. I now call on Minister Jim Fairley to respond on behalf of the Scottish Government to the debate. And if the Minister could take us to decision time at 5 p.m, that would be helpful.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I first of all add my contribution to the fact that Mairi Gougeon is leaving post, having worked with her and beside her for over a year now. I can say that she's been an absolutely phenomenal Cabinet Secretary, and she will be greatly missed by the Scottish Government. Presiding Officer, I would also like to associate myself with Douglas Ross's speech, because I think he very eloquently clarified for the Labour Party that they have simply got it confused, and I'd like to congratulate him on making those points very eloquently. I am delighted to be closing today's debate on behalf of the Scottish Government, because this is a debate, Presiding Officer, that is incredibly close to my heart. It's a debate that epitomises a lifelong passion and dedication to an industry that I am hugely proud of. I am proud to be a part of it. I am proud of the way it enhances an already phenomenal reputation that our country enjoys. I am proud of the role that the sector plays in the architecture of the landscape that draws the world to Scotland. I'm proud to be associated with the incredible, talented, hard-working, innovative, creative folk who make the Scottish food and drink scene as diverse and as exciting, as colourful and as successful as it has been, and it will continue to be. This Government is ambitious for Scotland and our iconic food and drink sector. Unlike the Labour and Conservatives, we believe in a strong, confident, independent Scotland, and our food and drink sector is absolutely central to that point. The Labour and Tory party just cannot bring themselves to celebrate and embrace this Scottish success story, which has for over 2 decades partnered the Scottish Government to help it become the absolute driver of so much that there is to be celebrated about Scotland. So there's a couple of points I'd like to make. Rhoda Grant was making the point that Scotland hasn't done nearly enough, as was Daniel Johnson. It hasn't done nearly enough in terms of our exports. A 2023 assessment of the value of the red meat sector estimates that it contributes £2.8 billion annually, up by over 16% since 2016, including £1.27 billion of on-farm output, £885 million from meat processing. Meanwhile, the QMS annual export survey found that a total value of Scotland's red meat offal sold outside the UK reached £137 million. Its exports had never previously exceeded £100 million. In our dairy sector, we have seen an increase of over 140% increase in Scottish cheeses, and the list of products that are exporting from Scotland could go on and on. So, Presiding Officer, I will refuse to be dragged down by the pessimism that has characterised in the Labour and Tory speeches, and I want to celebrate the fabulous businesses and the people at the very heart of our amazing food and drink sector. So in that, I'd like to take a wee wander down the road and reflect as to why our industry has been so successful, and take a positive look at where we want to go, despite the worst efforts of others. I'll take Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank the Minister for taking the intervention. We all recognise, I think, the importance of exports. Given the importance of exports to Scotland and the importance of, say, the American market, can the Minister tell us whether, when he met Eric Trump, whether the First Minister raised the issue of tariffs or exports with Mr Trump?
I think the member's asking the wrong member, because I'm not the First Minister and I wasn't in the meeting. Presiding Officer, I refuse to be dragged down by the pessimism that is characterised in Labour and Tory speeches, and I'm going to celebrate the fabulous business and the people who are at the very heart of our amazing food and drink sector. So I'm going to take this wee wander around the road and look at the positive things that we have done in the Scottish food sector. And I'm going to start in 2007, when there was a young whippersnapper minister by the name of Richard Lochhead, and he came up with the seemingly very odd idea of focusing the government's attention on what he thought was an overlooked opportunity for Scotland as a whole. Now, there were organisations at the time like Grampian Food Forum, and there were brilliant businesses like Walker Shopbread, who sold products globally before any other food brand was doing it, and then they helped others to do the same. There were farmers' markets selling at farmers. There was farmers selling at farmers' markets. There was fishers catching fish. And what we as a country failed to recognise was the world's best shellfish were gracing the tables of some of the best restaurants in the world and around Europe. The proliferation of fabulous restaurants, including Andrew Fairley at Gleneagles, and now in Perthshire, in my constituency, we've also got the fabulous Glenturret Lalique, which also has 2 stars. But when we were talking about these exports, they were done while we were in the EU, and that was when it was easy for us to do that. But there was no single body at that time or a strategy to bring all that together and turn it into a coordinated, focused being that could drive it to its real potential. So credit where it is due, the Lib Dem Minister Ross Finney had asked the sector to come up with a plan on looking to maximise the potential of the sector. The Grampian Food Forum had been doing some work in the same vein, so there was ideas that were swirling around and looking at the potential, but none of it had come to fruition at that point. So Richard came up with the idea of the first national food and drink policy for Scotland. So the first time ever, food and drink was given a food and drink team and a budget which absolutely turbocharged a sector which, up to that point, had been flatlining. And it turned it into the fastest growing sector in the Scottish economy. It drove growth, it drove innovation, it drove employment, it drove collaboration, and most of all, it drove ambition. Now, I remember clearly feeling the excitement that I was involved in a vibrant, driven industry that could take on the world and deliver real opportunities for the people of Scotland. And it did it, year after year after year. The growth it saw was phenomenal. And people just knew that they were onto something that had substance and longevity, so that they could invest, and they knew that they were building resilience and a future for the next generation. Bearing in mind, Presiding Officer, in those days, before we had galvanised ourselves, Scotland had a reputation of being famed for deep-fried Mars bars and deep-fried pizzas. But we turned that round so that we are now revered the world over. We now sell beer to the Germans, we sell sushi to the Japanese, we sell chocolate to the Belgians, and thanks to our rapeseed oil, we now sell oil to the Middle East. Presiding Officer, there is so much to celebrate, so much to be proud of, and so much for us to strive for, and this government fully intends to keep that ambition going. We continue our support of agriculture to the tune of over £660 million a year, including a £40 million fund aimed at producing calves for the beef trade while helping to reduce emissions. That is in stark contrast to the situation in England. The opportunities are there for the sector to aim, with the recent QMS analysis demonstrating that the demand for low-emission, top-quality beef is growing, and our Scotch sector is perfectly placed to capitalise on that demand. I don't have time. I'm told that there is no confidence in the sector. That's despite the beef price being stratospheric now to compare to what it was in the past. That is just reward for decades of commitment from the sector, and now with the opportunities of even more demand, the mantra of eating red and processed meat within the health guidelines is well made. But eat quality, lower emission meat is a message that we can get right behind as we target the huge opportunities as we go forward. But, Presiding Officer, of all that, plus the commitments this government has made in ensuring direct payments and co-design of policy, there is still a lack of confidence. So perhaps we need to look elsewhere as to why confidence is not soaring in the sector. Perhaps it's the catastrophic Brexit and the Liz Truss trade deals that have been done with huge agri-producing countries that are eyeing our lucrative market, with even more deals on the horizon. Perhaps it's watching the UK government completely abandon
Minister, if I might, I'm just aware of quite a lot of noise in the chamber. I'd be grateful if colleagues who are coming in and so on could do so quietly. Minister.
I was in full flow there, Cabinet Presiding Officer. Perhaps it's watching a UK government completely abandon any pretence about caring what happens to farmers in England and Wales as they take a wrecking ball to the systems of support for farmers down there. And I get that agriculture has devolved, but what message does it send to farmers when they are now being targeted with the inheritance tax that will impact the smooth transition of family farms and the viability of those businesses that feed our country? And if the agri-budgets are slashed in England and Wales, what happens to the block grant allocations repercussions for up here? This government will give the strongest possible messages and actions of reassurance about how we recognise and value the resilient agricultural sector. We do so because it is the bedrock of the food and drink sector, which feeds us. It generates economic growth and it employs hundreds of thousands of people and helps us to achieve our nature restoration, our emissions reductions, and it is our vehicle to manage and maintain the architecture of our landscape, which, as I am now repeating, but it bears repeating, is a magnet for the world to want to come and enjoy. It is the natural environment where we harvest venison and game, which helps us to reinstate with some of the magnificent landscapes we are blessed with. And we can and should do more to market and celebrate that natural larder, as well as our world-class famed produce. Presiding Officer, reimagining the future using the tools that we had in the past to build this sector in the future, collaborating and working with all the elements of the food and drink industry to optimise those opportunities that are before us, and to being imaginative and ambitious are all of the things that this government will do to ensure a future bursting with ideas, innovation and ambition for those that want to be a part of it. And when we do that collectively, Presiding Officer, that momentum becomes unstoppable and it benefits all the people of Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate on protecting and growing Scotland's iconic food and drink sector. It's now time to move on to the next item of business. And there are point of order, Douglas Ross.
I'm grateful, Presiding Officer. The debate that's just concluded started at 2:32 this afternoon. It was due to start 12 minutes earlier at 2:20. I welcome the fact that 3 topical questions were selected and there was a discussion on that. But having started 12 minutes later, we still concluded bang on 5 o'clock. And throughout this afternoon's debates, members have said they weren't able to take interventions because there was no time in hand. When a debate of such importance starts later, is there no latitude, Presiding Officer, for the decision time to be potentially 5:15 rather than 5 o'clock, so we can have a proper debate in this chamber?
Yeah. Thank you. Our business is, of course, agreed by the Parliament and has been agreed in this instance. There's usually some flex in a debate. That means that the time scheduled for the debate is as the debate management timeline would have it. I think it is very important that where the Parliament has agreed a specific decision time, that is adhered to wherever possible.
Just for clarity, Presiding Officer, and this isn't questioning your ruling, but the Bureau allocated a certain amount of time for this debate. And because the debate started later, we as members in the debate had less time. And the question then is, can decision time not be postponed slightly to allow the full allocation that the Business Bureau had given for this debate?
Yeah, just for clarity, Mr Ross, every member who spoke in the debate did receive their allocated time. The time that was used up in topical questions may have been extra time in the debate, if you understand, but all members received the agreed in advance allocated time per member. So members were not, the time that members were allowed was not shortened, it was the expected time. The flexibility in the debate is impacted where earlier items of business continue. I hope that's helpful. Now, there are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business, and the first is that Amendment 16839.2 in the name of Tim Eagle, which seeks to amend Motion 16839 in the name of Mairi Gougeon on protecting and growing Scotland's iconic food and drink sector be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access digital voting. The question is that Amendment 16839.2 in the name of Tim Eagle, which seeks to amend Motion 16839 in the name of Mairi Gougeon on protecting and growing Scotland's iconic food and drink sector, be agreed, and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. I call Co-Cab Stuart for a point of order.
App didn't connect in time and it's not registered a vote, but I was getting assistance. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Ms Stuart. We'll ensure that is recorded. I call Douglas Ross for a point of order.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My app wouldn't connect. I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Mr Ross. We'll ensure that's recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 16839.2 in the name of Tim Eagle is yes 46, no 64. There were 3 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 16839.1 in the name of Rhoda Grant, which seeks to amend motion 16839 in the name of Mairi Gougeon on protecting and growing Scotland's iconic food and drink sector, be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 16839.1 in the name of Rhoda Grant is yes 24, no 85. There were 6 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And the final question is that motion 16839 in the name of Mairi Gougeon on protecting and growing Scotland's iconic food and drink sector be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time. And we'll now move on to members' business in the name of Claire Adamson.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McMillan.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stuart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.